Some women marry their soulmates. Maria married her executioner. In Bogota, they whispered about the perfect wife who vanished, until they found what was left of her in the backyard. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker and truth cuts colder than fiction. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of the family. If you enjoy the stories, a like, comment, or subscribe helps keep the truth alive. Have you subscribed yet? I'll wait. Done? Perfect. Thank you. Now, this is the story of the Butcher's Bride. We hunt monsters in the dark, believing we'll recognize their faces. But what happens when the monster sleeps beside you, kisses your forehead each morning, and knows exactly how you taste? Tonight, we descend into a nightmare where love wore a butcher's apron, where wedding vows became death sentences, and where a woman named Maria Concepcion Ladino learned too late that she hadn't married a man. She'd invited a demon to feast on her bones. This is the story of how trust became torture, how a home became a tomb, and how the hands that once held her tenderly would be the same hands that carved her into pieces small enough to forget. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Maria Concepcion Ladino possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their own feet on Bogotá's crowded streets. At 28 years old, her laughter carried through the corridors of the textile factory where she worked, a sound like wind chimes in summer, delicate and full of promise. Her dark hair cascaded past her shoulders, catching sunlight in ways that seemed almost supernatural, and her eyes, those deep brown eyes, held an innocence that hadn't yet been poisoned by the cruelties of the world. She believed in fairy tales. She believed in happy endings. She believed that good people found good people, and that love, real love, conquered all darkness. How tragically, devastatingly wrong she was. The year was 1990, and Colombia writhed under the stranglehold of violence. Pablo Escobar's cartel had transformed the streets into rivers of blood, and death had become so commonplace that people barely flinched when they heard gunshots anymore. But Maria remained untouched by the darkness, cocooned in her simple life of factory work, Sunday masses, and family gatherings where her mother's sancocho filled the house with the aroma of comfort and safety. She dreamed of a husband, children, a small house with flowers in the window boxes. Simple dreams, beautiful dreams, dreams that would become her undoing. Aurelio Tovar entered her life like a summer storm, sudden, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. He was 42, 14 years her senior, a man whose face carried the weathered lines of someone who'd lived hard and survived harder. He worked as a butcher in the San Victorino market, his hands perpetually stained with the blood of cattle and pigs, his apron a canvas of crimson and rust. But when he smiled at Maria that first time, when their eyes met across the crowded bus they both took home from work, none of that mattered. His smile seemed genuine, warm, almost boyish despite his age. His voice, when he finally spoke to her, carried a gentleness that made her heart flutter with something she mistook for love. It was infatuation masquerading as destiny. It was predation disguised as romance. Aurelio courted her with an intensity that should have triggered alarms but instead set off fireworks in her innocent heart. He brought her flowers stolen from cemetery graves, though she never knew their origin, never noticed the funeral ribbons carefully removed from the stems. He wrote her letters in surprisingly elegant handwriting, letters that spoke of loneliness and longing, of a man who'd wandered through life waiting for someone like her to give him purpose. He told her about his difficult childhood, his absent father, his mother who died when he was just a boy. He painted himself as a survivor, a man hardened by circumstance but softened by her presence. He made her believe she could save him, heal him, transform him into the prince her fairy tales had promised. What Maria didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Aurelio had been watching her for months before that first accidental meeting. He'd learned her schedule with the precision of a predator studying prey. He knew which bus she took, which route she walked home, which church she attended on Sundays. He'd learned about her family, her friends, her habits and routines. He'd chosen her the way a butcher chooses a cut of meat, carefully, deliberately, with specific intentions for how he'd use every part of her. The courtship lasted 8 months. 8 months of flowers and letters, of walks through Simone Bolivar Park where Aurelio held her hand with surprising tenderness. 8 months of family dinners where he charmed Maria's mother with compliments and her father with talk of hard work and traditional values. 8 months where Maria's friends whispered concerns about the age difference, about something they couldn't quite name in Aurelio's eyes, something cold that lurked beneath the warm surface, like ice hidden under a frozen lake waiting to crack. But Maria heard only love songs. She saw only the future she dreamed of. She felt only the excitement of a woman who believed her real life was finally beginning. The wedding took place on a rain-soaked Saturday in November, in the same church where Maria had been baptized as an infant. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. The white lace yellowed with age but still beautiful, still sacred. Aurelio wore a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, the sleeves too short, the pants too long, but his smile never wavered. He held her hands during the vows, his butcher's hands that had wrung the life from countless animals, and he promised to love her, honor her, cherish her until death did them part. Death was already in the room, patient as a spider in its web, waiting for the feast to begin. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Ciudad Bolivar, one of Bogotá's poorest and most dangerous neighborhoods. The house squatted at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by similar dwellings that seemed to lean into each other for support, all of them painted in fading pastels that the rain had turned to ghosts of colors. Their particular house was painted a sickly yellow, with bars on the windows and a small backyard enclosed by a rusting chain-link fence. It wasn't much, but Maria decorated it with the enthusiasm of a woman building her castle. She hung curtains, placed doilies on the furniture, filled vases with fresh flowers, and cooked elaborate meals in the tiny kitchen that barely fit 2 people. For the first 3 weeks, Aurelio played the role of devoted husband with convincing skill. He came home from the butcher shop and kissed her cheek. He complimented her cooking. He made love to her with a gentleness that made her blush and giggle. He was everything she dreamed of, everything she'd prayed for during those long, lonely nights before he'd entered her life. But masks, even the most carefully crafted ones, eventually slip. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening when Maria accidentally overcooked the rice. She'd been distracted, lost in daydreams about the baby they'd soon try for, and the rice had turned to mush at the bottom of the pot. A small mistake the kind married couples laugh about and order takeout to fix. But when Aurelio tasted it, something shifted in his expression. The warmth drained from his eyes like water from a broken glass, and what remained was something else entirely. Something ancient and hungry and utterly devoid of the humanity he'd shown her before. He stood slowly from the table, and Maria's stomach clenched with a fear she didn't yet understand. He walked to the kitchen, picked up the pot of ruined rice, and returned to the dining room. Then, with a smile that never reached his cold eyes, he dumped the entire contents onto her plate, the hot rice burning her hands as she instinctively tried to catch it. "Eat it," he said quietly, his voice like silk over razor blades. "All of it. A good wife doesn't waste food." Maria stared at the mountain of mushy, burned rice, confusion and fear warring in her chest. "Aurelio, I eat it." She ate. She forced down every scalding, tasteless spoonful while he watched, his expression never changing, his eyes never blinking. When she finally finished, her stomach roiling, her throat raw, he smiled again and kissed the top of her head. "Good girl," he whispered. "You're learning." That night, Maria cried silently in the bathroom, her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle the sounds. She told herself it was just stress, that marriage was an adjustment, that every couple had rough patches. She convinced herself that she'd been at fault for ruining dinner, that Aurelio's reaction, while harsh, came from a place of wanting to teach her, to help her become a better wife. The lies we tell ourselves to survive are often more dangerous than the truths we're hiding from. The second incident came a week later. Maria had gone to visit her mother without explicitly asking Aurelio's permission first. It hadn't occurred to her that she needed permission. Her mother lived only a few miles away, and she'd simply taken the bus after work to share some gossip and drink coffee. She'd been gone for 3 hours, returning home with a container of her mother's famous arepas and a light heart. Aurelio was waiting for her in the dark living room, every light in the house extinguished. She fumbled for the switch, calling out his name with slight concern, wondering if he'd fallen asleep. When the lights blazed on, she found him sitting in his chair, still wearing his blood-stained butcher's apron, his hands folded in his lap like a patient predator. "Where were you?" The question came soft as a lover's whisper, deadly as a serpent's hiss. "At my mother's. I brought arepas, your favorite." The slap came so fast she didn't see his hand move. One moment she was smiling, holding up the container of food like a peace offering, and the next she was on the floor, her cheek exploding with pain, the container scattered across the tiles, arepas crushed and ruined. "You don't leave this house without my permission," Aurelio said, standing over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You don't visit anyone, you don't go anywhere, you don't breathe without asking me first. Do you understand?" Maria's ears rang. Blood trickled from her split lip, tasting of copper and terror. She nodded, unable to speak, unable to process how quickly her prince had transformed into this monster. But he wasn't done teaching her yet. Oh no, the lessons were just beginning. He made her clean up the scattered arepas with her hands, picking up every crumb, while he watched from his chair. Then he made her eat them, dirt and all, straight from the floor, while he smiled that terrible smile and told her about gratitude, about respect, about the proper behavior of wives. When she gagged, he held her hair back almost tenderly, whispering that she was doing so well, that she was learning, that soon she'd be perfect. That night marked the true beginning of Maria's descent into hell. The man she'd married revealed himself to be nothing more than a carefully constructed disguise, and beneath it lurked something that wore human skin but operated on alien frequencies of cruelty and control. The house that was supposed to be her castle became her prison. The husband who'd promised to cherish her became her warden, her torturer, her personal demon. And the worst part, the truly devastating part, was that Maria blamed herself. She absorbed his twisted logic like poison, believing that if she could just be better, more obedient, more perfect, then the gentle Aurelio would return. She didn't yet understand that the gentle Aurelio had never existed at all. He'd been bait, nothing more, a lure to draw her into the trap that had now snapped shut around her throat. The transformation of Maria Concepcion Ladino from a vibrant young woman into a ghost haunting her own life happened with terrifying efficiency. Within 2 months of marriage, the woman who'd laughed like wind chimes had learned to move through her house in absolute silence, her footsteps featherlight, her breathing shallow and controlled. She'd learned which floorboards creaked, which doors needed to be opened with painstaking slowness, which words triggered Aurelio's rage and which might earn her a few hours of peace. She'd become a student of survival, and her husband was a merciless teacher. Aurelio's brutality operated on a schedule as precise as a Swiss watch, though Maria could never predict which hour would bring punishment and which might offer respite. He worked at the butcher shop 6 days a week, leaving the house at dawn and returning as dusk swallowed the city. Those hours when he was gone should have been Maria's sanctuary, but he'd poisoned even that small mercy. Before leaving each morning, he'd conduct inspections, checking that all windows remained locked, that the phone cord was unplugged and hidden in his coat pocket, that the front door's deadbolt required his personal key to open from either side. He'd trapped her as thoroughly as any cage, and the walls of her prison were painted that sickly yellow she'd once thought charming. The phone cord was a particular source of torment. Maria's mother called regularly, or at least she tried to, and the unanswered rings echoed through the empty house like accusations. After the 3rd week of silence, her mother arrived unannounced, pounding on the door, shouting Maria's name with increasing panic. Aurelio had been home that day. It was Sunday, his day of rest, and he'd answered the door with his most charming smile, inviting Maria's mother inside with exaggerated hospitality. "Maria's been feeling under the weather," he'd explained, his hand resting possessively on Maria's shoulder, fingers digging in just hard enough to leave bruises shaped like warning signs. Nothing serious, just a bug. You know how she is, always pushing herself too hard. I've been making her rest. Maria had nodded along, her smile brittle as ancient paper, her eyes screaming the truth her mouth couldn't form. But her mother, desperate to believe that her daughter had found happiness, saw only what Aurelio wanted her to see: a concerned husband caring for his ailing wife. She'd left with promises to bring soup, to check in regularly, to call before visiting next time. After she left, Aurelio had locked the door and turned to Maria with that expression she'd learned to dread: calm, measured, deliberately devoid of emotion. He'd said nothing, simply removed his belt with practiced slowness, folding it in half so the leather cracked like thunder. The beating that followed lasted hours or perhaps only minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything beyond the spaces between impacts. When it was over, when Maria lay curled on the floor like a broken doll, Aurelio had knelt beside her and whispered almost lovingly into her ear, "You did well today, but if you ever let anything show on your face again, if you ever let anyone suspect, I'll kill your mother next. Do you understand? I'll cut her into pieces and make you watch." Maria understood. God help her, she understood completely. The violence escalated with the sick creativity of a mind unhinged. Aurelio's profession as a butcher had given him intimate knowledge of anatomy, of how bodies could be broken without leaving obvious evidence, of which bones would heal crooked if not set properly. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to leave bruises that flowered beneath clothing, never on visible skin. He understood which strikes would incapacitate without killing, which torments would break the spirit while leaving the body technically functional. He burned her with cigarettes in places no one would ever see. The soles of her feet, the soft skin of her inner thighs, the small of her back. He'd stubbed them out with meditative slowness, watching her face while she bit down on a wooden spoon he'd placed between her teeth to muffle her screams. The neighbors lived close enough to hear, he'd explained casually, and he wouldn't have anyone interfering in their private business. He carved his initials into her hip with one of his butcher knives, working slowly, artistically, like a sculptor approaching marble. The infection that followed nearly killed her, and she'd spent 3 days delirious with fever while Aurelio nursed her back to health with surprising tenderness, bringing her water and cool cloths, whispering that he loved her, that she was his, that she'd never escape him because they were bound together now, literally written into each other's flesh. Food became a weapon. Some days he'd forbid her to eat entirely, watching her grow weak and hollow-eyed, then force-feeding her until she vomited. Other days he'd prepare elaborate meals. Meals that tasted wrong, chemically bitter, that left her dizzy and disoriented. She suspected he was drugging her, mixing something into the food, but she couldn't refuse to eat without triggering worse punishments. The world took on a dreamlike quality, reality blurring at the edges, time becoming elastic and unreliable. Sleep offered no escape. Aurelio had developed a game he called Midnight Lessons, where he'd wake her at random hours, dragging her from bed to quiz her on the rules he'd established. If she answered incorrectly, or too slowly, or with insufficient enthusiasm, punishments followed. She learned to sleep lightly, always partially conscious, always waiting for his hand to shake her awake and his voice to start the interrogation. "Who do you belong to? You, Aurelio. Who decides if you live or die? You do, Aurelio. What happens to disobedient wives? They disappear, Aurelio. Good girl. Gold star." Another day of survival purchased with the currency of self-erasure. The sexual abuse was perhaps the cruelest torture of all, because it perverted what should have been intimacy into something monstrous. Aurelio's desires ran toward the sadistic, and he'd forced Maria to participate in acts that left her feeling hollowed out, less than human, reduced to meat and function. He'd photograph her sometimes, keeping the pictures in a locked box she'd discovered once while cleaning. The images showed things she couldn't remember doing, positions she didn't recall assuming, her face wearing expressions that belonged to someone else entirely. Vacant, drugged, gone. She began to fragment. The Maria who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings ceased to exist, replaced by a creature whose only goal was survival, whose only skill was anticipating and adapting to the monster's needs. She stopped thinking of him as Aurelio, started referring to him in her mind simply as him, as if naming him might make him more real, more permanent. She stopped thinking of herself as Maria, too, or even as human. She was simply it, the thing that occupied the space where a woman used to live. But somewhere deep inside, buried under layers of trauma and terror, a tiny spark of the real Maria still existed. And that spark recognized a fundamental truth. This couldn't continue indefinitely. Either she would die, slowly, agonizingly, piece by piece, or she would have to do something unthinkable. The thought terrified her more than anything else, more than the beatings or the burns or the midnight lessons, because thinking it meant acknowledging that she'd considered it, that she'd crossed some invisible line from victim to potential perpetrator. She began to plan, not consciously at first, but in small, scattered thoughts she barely acknowledged. She noticed where he kept his knives, which ones stayed sharpest. She observed his patterns, when he slept deepest, when he was most vulnerable. She memorized the location of the single phone booth 3 blocks away, the one she'd spotted during the rare occasions he'd permitted her outside under his supervision. She cataloged the hiding places in the house, places small enough for evidence, for tools, for hope. The planning kept her sane, gave her something beyond mere survival to focus on. She didn't know if she'd ever have the courage to act on these observations, but having them felt like rebellion, like reclaiming some tiny portion of her stolen agency. He could control her body, dictate her every movement, but he couldn't completely invade her thoughts. Not yet, anyway, though she sometimes feared that too was coming. Then came the day that changed everything, the day that transformed planning into desperate necessity. It started like any other horror. Aurelio coming home from the butcher shop with blood under his fingernails and that look in his eyes, the one that meant he'd had a difficult day and would take it out on his wife's skin. But this time he brought something extra. He dropped a heavy canvas bag on the kitchen table with a wet, meaty thump, and Maria's stomach turned even before she saw what it contained. "Come here," he commanded, and she obeyed, moving on autopilot, her body responding before her mind fully processed the order. He opened the bag slowly, theatrically, watching her face. Inside was a pig's head, freshly severed, the eyes still glassy and vacant, blood pooling at the bottom of the bag. He lifted it out, holding it up like a trophy, like Salome displaying John the Baptist. "Do you know why I brought this home?" His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. Maria shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Because I want you to understand something. I want you to see what I do, how easy it is to reduce something living and breathing into nothing but meat and bone. This pig probably had thoughts in its limited way, probably felt fear when I approached with my tools. It probably hoped, in whatever primitive manner pigs hope, that it might escape. But it didn't escape. It never had a chance. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. She understood that this was more than a lesson. It was a promise, a preview of her own fate if she ever tried to leave, ever tried to fight back, ever tried to be anything other than the perfect, obedient thing he'd molded her into. He made her help him butcher the pig's head that night, guiding her hands as they sectioned meat from bone, teaching her the proper techniques with the patience of a master instructing a prized pupil. His hands covered hers on the knife handle, his breath hot on her neck, his voice a constant murmur of instruction and implicit threat. When they finished, hours later, the kitchen looked like an abattoir, blood painting the walls and floor in abstract patterns that Maria knew she'd be forced to clean until no trace remained. "See how easy that was?" Aurelio had said, washing his hands in the sink, watching her reflection in the window. "Human bones aren't much different, you know. Same principles apply. Same tools work just as well. Something to think about." That night, after he'd fallen asleep, Maria lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to his snores, feeling the weight of his arm thrown across her chest like a chain. The spark inside her that had been carefully planning, slowly building toward some distant moment of action, suddenly ignited into flame. The thought that had been theoretical became immediate, urgent, undeniable. She had to kill him. There was no other way out. He'd made that abundantly clear tonight. She would never escape through normal means. He'd track her down, butcher her like that pig, and probably kill her family too just to make a point. The only way this ended was if one of them died, and she'd already spent too many months dying slowly. It was time for him to die instead. The decision settled over her like a cold blanket, bringing with it a strange sense of calm. She wasn't Maria anymore, the naive girl who'd believed in fairy tales. She wasn't even the broken thing he'd spent months creating. She was something new, something crystallized by desperation and horror into a form hard enough to do what needed doing. She was a woman who'd seen her own death previewed in a pig's vacant eyes and decided to write a different ending. She began to plan in earnest, every detail carefully considered. She couldn't simply stab him in his sleep. He was larger, stronger, and even wounded he might overpower her. She needed certainty, finality, something that would end him before he had a chance to turn her into the thing he'd promised. She needed to be smart, patient, careful. She needed to become, just for one night, exactly the monster he'd spent months creating. 3 weeks of meticulous preparation followed Maria's decision to kill her husband. 3 weeks where she perfected the art of complete submission, becoming so obedient, so eager to please, that Aurelio's suspicions dissolved into smug satisfaction. He believed he'd finally broken her completely, had transformed the defiant spark of the woman he'd married into the perfect, docile wife he'd always wanted. He couldn't have known that her submission was strategic, that every yes, Aurelio, and whatever you want, my love, was laying groundwork for his execution. Maria studied him with the intensity of a scientist observing a dangerous specimen. She cataloged his habits, his weaknesses, the precise rhythm of his days. She learned that he took sleeping pills on Friday nights, downing them with Cheapaguardiant to ensure he'd sleep through until noon on Saturdays. She discovered where he kept his spare cash, nearly 2 million pesos hidden in a coffee can in the garage, money he'd been saving for reasons he never explained. She memorized the weight of his favorite butcher knife, the one he'd used to carve his initials into her flesh, the one he kept sharpened to a surgical edge. The hardest part was maintaining her performance while simultaneously preparing for murder. She had to continue being the victim he expected while secretly becoming someone capable of violence. The contradiction threatened to split her into pieces, but she held herself together through sheer force of will. She reminded herself daily that this wasn't murder in any conventional sense. It was self-defense, preemptive perhaps, but no less valid. It was survival. It was justice in a world where the law had failed her, where her screams for help had gone unheard by neighbors who turned up their televisions to drown out the sounds of her suffering. She chose Friday, November 15th, 1991, as the night Aurelio Tovar would die. 13 months after their wedding, an unlucky number that seemed appropriate for the end of their cursed union. That afternoon, she played the role of devoted wife with Oscar-worthy commitment. She prepared his favorite meal, bandeja paisa with extra chicharron, and served it with a smile that didn't waver even when he criticized the seasoning. She laughed at his crude jokes, thanked him for the roof over her head, and told him how lucky she was to have such a strong, decisive husband. The performance made her want to vomit, but she maintained it flawlessly. After dinner, Aurelio settled into his chair with his bottle of Aguardiente and his sleeping pills, following his Friday night ritual with predictable precision. Maria cleaned the kitchen, moving slowly, waiting for the drugs and alcohol to take effect. She hummed while she worked, a cheerful tune that masked the screaming in her head, the terror and determination warring for dominance in her chest. She was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, about to transform from victim into killer, and part of her, the part that still remembered church and prayers and fairy tales, begged her to stop. But a larger part, the part that bore scars he'd carved into her flesh, that remembered every burn and bruise and violation, whispered that she'd already been transformed. Aurelio had made her into this. Whatever happened tonight was his creation as much as hers. By 10 o'clock, Aurelio's head lolled against the chair's backrest, his snores rattling through the house like death's own breathing. Maria approached him slowly, testing his unconsciousness with progressively bolder touches. First his shoulder, then his face, finally his eyelids, lifting them to reveal eyes rolled back in his skull. He was deeply under, exactly as she'd needed him to be. She retrieved the knife from the kitchen, the same one he'd used on her, holding it like a sacred object. Her hands trembled violently, adrenaline making her entire body shake with such intensity she worried she'd drop the blade. She stood before her unconscious husband, this monster who destroyed her life, and discovered that killing, even killing in self-defense, even killing someone who deserved to die, was infinitely harder than she'd imagined. This was a human being, her mind whispered. A monster, yes, but human nonetheless. Could she really do this? Could she plunge a knife into living flesh, watch blood pour out, watch life drain from eyes that had once looked at her with something resembling affection? Then she glanced down at her own body, at the scars visible even through her clothing, at the fading bruises that formed a calendar of her suffering. She remembered the pig's head, the implicit promise it represented. She thought about her mother, about the threat he'd made, about the certainty that this would only end with someone's death. She raised the knife. The first strike was clumsy, fueled by desperation rather than precision. She'd aimed for his heart but hit his shoulder instead, the blade glancing off bone with a scraping sound that made her stomach lurch. Aurelio's eyes snapped open, confusion and rage warring on his face as consciousness returned in a violent rush. He surged from the chair with a roar that shook the walls, his hand grabbing her wrist, twisting until she screamed and nearly dropped the knife. "You little—" His words dissolved into incoherent fury as he slammed her against the wall, her head cracking against plaster hard enough to explode stars across her vision. But Maria had gone beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond everything except the certainty that this moment defined whether she'd live or die. She brought her knee up hard between his legs, and when he doubled over with a grunt of agony, she drove the knife down with all her strength, all her accumulated rage, all 13 months of torture compressed into a single desperate strike. This time, the blade found its mark. The knife plunged into his back, between his shoulder blades, sinking deep into flesh and muscle and whatever lay beneath. Aurelio made a sound unlike anything Maria had ever heard. Not quite a scream, not quite a groan, something primal and terrible that would haunt her nightmares for whatever remained of her life. He staggered, reaching behind himself in a futile attempt to dislodge the blade, his face twisted into an expression of shocked betrayal. "How could you?" he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "I loved you." The statement was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that Maria laughed. A high, hysterical sound that didn't seem to come from her at all. Loved her? This man who'd beaten her, burned her, carved into her flesh, systematically destroyed everything she'd once been. He believed he'd loved her? "No," she whispered, pulling the knife free and raising it again. "You never loved me. You loved having power over me. You loved breaking me. You loved playing God." She struck again, and again, and again. She stopped counting after the 7th blow, stopped seeing Aurelio as human at all. He became nothing but an obstacle to survival, a problem to be solved with violent finality. Blood sprayed across her face, her clothes, the walls, painting the living room in evidence of her desperation and his crimes. He fell to his knees, then to his side, his hands scrambling weakly at the floor, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "Please," he managed, the word barely audible. "Please." Maria stood over him, the knife dripping red, her chest heaving with exhaustion and emotions she couldn't name. Part of her wanted to stop, to call an ambulance, to return to being the good person she'd once believed herself to be. But that person no longer existed, and even if she could somehow resurrect her, Aurelio would recover, would testify, would ensure Maria spent the rest of her life in prison for daring to fight back. So she didn't stop. She kept striking until he stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped being anything other than meat and bone and the rapidly cooling evidence of her emancipation. When it was finally irrevocably over, she dropped the knife and collapsed beside his corpse, her body shaking with sobs that felt like they might tear her apart from the inside. She'd done it. She'd killed him. She was free. But freedom, she discovered in that moment of horrified clarity, came with a price she hadn't fully considered. She was covered in blood, sitting beside the body of her husband, in a house where their neighbors had heard nothing unusual because screaming had become so commonplace they'd learned to ignore it. She had no alibi, no witnesses to the months of abuse, no evidence beyond her scars that might convince anyone she'd acted in self-defense rather than malicious murder. And she had a body to dispose of. The realization crashed over her like cold water, shocking her from hysteria into a state of eerie calm. If she called the police, she'd be arrested immediately. They'd see a dead man and his blood-soaked wife, and they'd draw the obvious conclusion. The justice system wouldn't care about cigarette burns hidden beneath her clothes or initials carved into her hip. They'd care only about the corpse on her living room floor and the knife in her hand. She had to think. She had to be smart. She'd come this far. She couldn't afford to fail now. She spent an hour sitting beside Aurelio's body, her mind racing through possibilities, discarding them one by one. She couldn't bury him in the backyard. The ground was too hard, and someone might see. She couldn't drive him somewhere remote. She didn't have a car or know how to drive. She couldn't burn him, the smoke would attract attention. Every option led to discovery, to arrest, to prison, or worse. Then she remembered his lessons. She remembered the pig's head, the way he'd systematically butchered it, reducing something that had once lived and breathed into manageable pieces. She remembered his patient instruction, his hands guiding hers through the process, his voice explaining the proper techniques for separating flesh from bone. He'd taught her how to make things disappear. The thought made her recoil instinctively, horror washing over her in waves. She wouldn't reduce her husband to pieces, no matter how monstrous he'd been. That would make her no better than him, would transform her from victim defending herself into something truly evil. But what choice did she have? She'd already crossed the line from victim to killer. Was butchering his corpse really worse than the murder itself? And more pragmatically, what other option existed that wouldn't end with her arrest? She spent the next hour arguing with herself, morality warring with pragmatism, disgust battling desperation. In the end, survival won. It always did. She'd learned that lesson well over 13 months of marriage to a monster. Maria dragged Aurelio's body into the bathroom, her muscles screaming with the effort. He was heavy in death, a dead weight in the most literal sense, and it took her 3 attempts to maneuver him into the bathtub. She stripped off her blood-soaked clothes, standing naked and shaking in her own bathroom, looking at the corpse of the man who'd sworn to love her until death did them part. Death had parted them. She'd made sure of it. What followed was the longest, most nightmarish night of Maria Concepcion Ladino's life. She gathered Aurelio's butcher knives from the kitchen, the ones he'd kept obsessively sharp, the ones he'd used to demonstrate his craft and threaten her future. Her hands still trembled, but they were steadier now, guided by grim necessity rather than rage. She filled the bathtub with water to contain the mess, then knelt beside it like a penitent at confession, except her prayers were curses and her sacrament was dismemberment. The first cut was the hardest, not technically but psychologically. The blade pressed against flesh that had once been warm, that had once moved with intention and malice. But once she started, once blood clouded the water and the reality of what she was doing became undeniable, something in her mind simply disconnected. She floated above herself, watching from a distance as her hands worked with increasing efficiency, following the lessons he'd forced on her with the pig's head. She found the joints, the places where bone separated from bone, where ligaments could be severed with minimal effort. She worked methodically, fighting back vomit, fighting back tears, fighting back the knowledge of what this was making her become. Hours passed. The night deepened. Outside, Ciudad Bolivar slept, oblivious to the horror unfolding in the yellow house at the end of the dirt road. Maria worked in silence, pausing occasionally to retch into the toilet, to splash water on her face, to remind herself why this was necessary. The bathroom became an abattoir, the bathtub a crimson pool, her hands instruments of obliteration. She separated him into pieces small enough to be manageable, wrapping each in plastic bags she'd collected over months of grocery shopping. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, Aurelio Tovar had ceased to exist as a coherent entity. He'd become parcels, packages, problems to be solved individually rather than as a whole. Maria stood in the bathroom, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, covered in blood and worse things, staring at the results of her night's work with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. She'd done it. She'd made him disappear, piece by piece, exactly as he'd taught her. But now came the even more dangerous part, disposal. She couldn't keep the pieces in the house, couldn't risk discovery. She needed to scatter them, spread them across the city in ways that would prevent anyone from ever reconstructing what had happened, from ever connecting the pieces back to her or this house. She showered, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, watching pink water spiral down the drain. She burned her bloody clothes in the backyard, feeding them piece by piece into a rusty barrel they'd used for trash, making sure the flames consumed every thread of evidence. She cleaned the bathroom with bleach so strong it burned her lungs, scrubbing every surface until her hands bled, until no trace of blood remained visible to the naked eye. Then she slept, collapsing into bed as the sun rose, sleeping the dreamless sleep of absolute exhaustion. When she woke 12 hours later, she almost believed it had been a nightmare, that she'd find Aurelio in his chair, alive and cruel and eternal. But the bathroom still reeked of bleach, and the plastic-wrapped parcels hidden in the garage confirmed the terrible reality. Over the next 3 weeks, Maria disposed of her husband piece by piece, bag by bag, across Bogotá's sprawling urban landscape. She took buses to different neighborhoods, walked to remote areas, and left packages in dumpsters, construction sites, and abandoned buildings. She scattered him like ashes, making sure no two pieces would ever be found together. Some went into the Bogotá River weighed down with rocks. Others went into trash heaps in the city's poorest barrios, places where garbage trucks came irregularly and scavengers picked through refuse without reporting unusual findings to authorities who wouldn't care anyway. She became intimately familiar with the city's geography of neglect, all the places where things and people disappeared without notice. Each disposal was a carefully planned operation, executed with the precision of someone who understood that a single mistake meant prison or death. She varied her routes, her timing, her methods. She never visited the same location twice. She learned to move through the city like a ghost, unremarkable and unmemorable, just another poor woman going about her business in a city too violent and chaotic to pay attention to one more forgettable face. The final piece, his head. She kept longest unable to decide how to dispose of it. It seemed too significant, too definitively human to simply toss in a dumpster. But eventually, pragmatism won over sentiment. She weighted it heavily and dropped it into the Bogotá River from a bridge at midnight, watching the bag sink into dark water, taking with it the face that had smiled during their wedding, that had twisted with rage during beatings, that had looked at her with shock and betrayal as she'd driven a knife into his back. Then it was done. Aurelio Tovar had been erased from existence, and Maria was alone with her secrets and her scars. The immediate aftermath of Aurelio's disappearance unfolded with surprising ease, at least initially. Maria reported him missing to the police 3 days after his death, playing the role of concerned wife with the same skill she'd used to play obedient victim. She told them he'd left for work one morning and never come home, that this was unusual behavior, that she was worried something terrible had happened. The police officer who took her report barely looked up from his paperwork, his expression conveying exactly how much he cared about one more missing person in a city where people vanished daily. Probably ran off with another woman, he said dismissively, his pen scratching against the form. Happens all the time. Give it a few weeks, he'll show up drunk and apologetic, or he won't show up at all. Either way, there's not much we can do. Maria nodded, wringing her hands, letting tears pool in her eyes without falling. But he wouldn't just leave. We're married. He loves me. The officer's skeptical expression suggested he'd heard similar claims countless times before. He took down the basic information: name, age, physical description, last known location, and filed the report in a stack that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. He told her to check back in a week, but his tone indicated he expected her never to return. She didn't. She'd done what was necessary to establish a timeline, to create the appearance of a distraught wife seeking her missing husband. Now she needed to disappear into the normalcy of widowhood, to become just another woman whose husband had abandoned her in a country where such abandonments were tragically common. Aurelio's boss at the butcher shop called after a week, asking where Aurelio had gone, whether he was coming back to work. Maria told him the same story. Her husband had disappeared. She didn't know where he'd gone. She was beside herself with worry. The boss grumbled about unreliable employees and hung up, probably already interviewing replacements. People were expendable in Ciudad Bolivar, in Bogota, in Colombia during those violent years. One more missing butcher barely registered as notable. The hardest part was dealing with her family. Her mother arrived at the house demanding answers, her father close behind, both of them convinced that something terrible had happened to their son-in-law. Maria maintained her performance flawlessly, sobbing into her mother's shoulder, accepting their comfort while feeling like a fraud, a monster wearing her own skin. They stayed with her for 3 days, helping her look through Aurelio's belongings for clues about where he might have gone. And Maria had to act grateful while terror screamed through her veins that they'd somehow discover evidence she'd missed. Some stray piece of proof that would unravel her carefully constructed lie. But they found nothing because there was nothing to find. She'd been meticulous, obsessive in her cleaning and disposal. The house had been scrubbed clean of evidence, and Aurelio's belongings revealed only the mundane details of a butcher's life. Work clothes, a few personal items, the cash she'd already discovered in the garage. Nothing suggested violence or foul play, nothing pointed toward murder. Her mother wanted her to move back home, to leave the house where she'd lived with Aurelio, to return to the safety of her childhood bedroom. But Maria refused gently but firmly. She couldn't leave, she explained, because what if Aurelio came back and she wasn't there? What if he needed her? The argument was absurd. She knew he'd never return because she'd personally distributed him across Bogota, but it served her purposes. She needed to stay in the house, to maintain control over the space where the murder had occurred, to ensure no one else discovered something she'd overlooked. Besides, returning to her parents' house would mean losing the one thing she'd gained from this nightmare: independence, freedom, the ability to breathe without permission, to exist without fear, to simply be without constantly monitoring someone else's mood. She'd paid for that freedom in blood and horror, and she wasn't about to surrender it now. As weeks turned into months, the questions gradually faded. Aurelio Tovar became just another statistic, another man who disappeared into Colombia's chaos, probably dead in a ditch somewhere or living under an assumed name in Venezuela. People stopped asking about him. Life moved forward, and Maria discovered that she was unexpectedly good at being alone, at existing without the structure of fear that had defined her married life. She kept working at the textile factory, maintaining her routine, projecting normalcy. But privately, in the house she no longer considered a prison, she began the slow, painful process of reconstructing herself. She was 29 years old and had already lived enough horror for several lifetimes. The woman she'd been before Aurelio, the innocent girl who believed in fairy tales, was dead, killed as surely as if he'd completed his threats. But the woman she was now, forged in trauma and tempered by violence, was something new, something harder, something that might actually survive. She removed the bars from the windows, hiring a worker who asked no questions and accepted cash payment. She painted over the sickly yellow walls, choosing a pale blue that reminded her of sky, of openness, of possibilities beyond these walls. She threw away everything that had belonged to Aurelio, every piece of clothing, every personal item, purging the house of his presence as thoroughly as she'd purged the world of his body. She planted flowers in the backyard, directly over the spot where she'd burned her bloody clothes, watching beauty grow from ash. The scars on her body would never fade, the cigarette burns, the carved initials, the bruises that had healed crooked, but she stopped seeing them as marks of shame. They became evidence instead, proof that she'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. They were her credentials, her resume, her documentation of expertise in the field of continuing to breathe when everything suggested she should have given up. 6 months after Aurelio's death, Maria went on a date. A coworker from the factory had been asking her for weeks, a kind man named Rodrigo who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. She'd refused repeatedly, terrified of men, of relationships, of ever again allowing someone that close. But slowly, carefully, she'd begun to realize that not all men were Aurelio, that not all relationships ended in horror. So she'd said yes, and they'd gone for coffee, and she'd spent the entire time monitoring his body language, searching for warning signs, prepared to run at the first hint of danger. But Rodrigo was just Rodrigo, a gentle man who talked about his family, who laughed at her nervous jokes, who walked her home and said goodnight without expecting anything in return. When he asked for a second date, she agreed, and then a third, and slowly, painfully, Maria began to remember what normal human interaction felt like. She remained guarded, kept him at careful distance, never invited him into her house where ghosts of violence still lingered in corners only she could see. But the fact that she could even contemplate companionship felt like a victory, a reclamation of humanity she'd thought Aurelio had destroyed forever. Then came the day everything nearly unraveled. 14 months after Aurelio's disappearance, a construction crew working near the Bogota River discovered human remains, partial remains, bones picked clean by water and scavengers, impossible to identify without extensive forensic work that the overwhelmed police department wasn't inclined to conduct. But the discovery made the news. A brief mention in the local section about unidentified remains probably belonging to another victim of cartel violence, and Maria's blood turned to ice when she saw the report. She'd been so careful about disposal, but water was unpredictable. Currents shifted, river levels changed, things that should have stayed hidden sometimes surfaced. She spent days in a state of barely controlled panic, waiting for police to knock on her door, for someone to make connections that would lead back to her. She prepared herself for arrest, rehearsing the story she'd tell. The abuse, the self-defense, the desperate measures, knowing it probably wouldn't matter, that she'd spend the rest of her life in prison regardless. But the knock never came. The remains were filed away as unidentified. Another John Doe in a city full of them, and gradually Maria's terror subsided back into manageable anxiety. The incident taught her an important lesson, though. She would never be completely safe, never fully free from the shadow of what she'd done. She'd carry this secret forever, and it would shape every choice, every relationship, every moment of whatever life remained to her. 2 years after Aurelio's death, Maria married Rodrigo in a small, quiet ceremony attended by only immediate family. She told him a carefully edited version of her first marriage, that Aurelio had been abusive, that he'd disappeared, that she'd spent years recovering from trauma. Rodrigo had listened with compassion, had held her while she cried, real tears, genuine grief for the person she might have been if Aurelio had never entered her life, and had promised never to hurt her, to be patient, to love her despite her damage. She believed him, mostly, but she also kept certain precautions in place. She never gave him keys to the house she still owned, the house where Aurelio had died. She maintained separate bank accounts. She learned self-defense, taking classes at a gym where women trained to protect themselves, where instructors taught weak points and effective strikes and the mindset necessary to do violence when violence became necessary. She would never again be helpless, never again be trapped, never again be anyone's victim. Rodrigo didn't need to know why she took these precautions. He accepted them as quirks born from past trauma, never suspecting the deeper truth, that his wife had killed before and had learned from that experience that she was capable of doing it again if circumstances demanded. Maria loved him, or something approximating love, but she'd learned that love and survival operated on different frequencies, and survival always won when they came into conflict. The years passed. Maria and Rodrigo had 2 children, both daughters, both beautiful and healthy and utterly unaware of their mother's history. She raised them with fierce protectiveness, teaching them self-reliance and strength, making sure they understood from earliest childhood that they owed no one obedience simply because society expected it. She wanted them to be harder than she'd been, less susceptible to fairy tales and promises, more capable of recognizing danger before it consumed them. She never told them about Aurelio. As far as her daughters knew, their mother had been briefly married in her youth to a man who'd abandoned her. Nothing more dramatic than that. The truth remained locked away in Maria's memory, visited only during sleepless nights when guilt or fear or simple acknowledgement of reality demanded she remember what she'd done, what she'd been capable of doing. The yellow house, repainted, renovated, transformed into something unrecognizable from the prison it had once been, remained in her possession. She rented it out to tenants, using the income to save for her daughter's education, but she never told Rodrigo or anyone else the full history of that property. Sometimes she'd drive past it, looking at the cheerful family who lived there now, children playing in the backyard where she'd burned evidence of murder, and she'd feel a strange disconnect from that time, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. In a way, it had. The woman who'd killed Aurelio Tovar had been a desperate creature driven to the absolute edge of survival. The woman Maria had become, mother, wife, factory supervisor, valued member of her community, bore only superficial resemblance to that terrified girl with a knife. She'd built a new life on the foundation of violence, and if that foundation sometimes felt unstable, well, she'd learned to walk carefully, to maintain balance, to keep building upward despite the corruption at her core. 30 years after Aurelio's death, Maria Concepcion Ladino sat in her comfortable living room, gray-haired and grandmother to 5, watching her extended family celebrate Christmas. Her daughters had grown into strong, independent women who took no disrespect from anyone. Her grandchildren played without fear, growing up in a Colombia slowly healing from decades of violence. Rodrigo dozed in his chair, snoring softly, a kind man who'd kept his promises and loved her despite the walls she'd never fully dismantled. It was a good life, a life she'd fought for and earned through unimaginable horror. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she wondered if she deserved it, if murderers got to have happy endings, if monsters got to disguise themselves as grandmothers and live peacefully surrounded by people who'd be horrified if they knew the truth. But mostly, she just lived. She'd learned that guilt and joy could coexist, that people were complicated mixes of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, broken and healing all at once. She'd learned that survival sometimes required becoming the thing you feared, and that you could come back from that darkness without being completely consumed by it. She'd learned that fairy tales were lies, but that didn't mean happy endings were impossible. They just looked different than you'd imagined, and they cost more than you'd ever wanted to pay. Maria Concepcion Ladino died in her sleep at age 73, surrounded by family who mourned her passing and celebrated a life well lived. They buried her in the same cemetery where she'd married Aurelio Tovar 50 years earlier, though the chapel had been renovated and the priest was different and no one remembered that earlier ceremony. Her obituary described a devoted mother and grandmother, a hard worker, a woman who'd overcome adversity to build something beautiful. It never mentioned the year she'd spent married to a monster. It never mentioned the night she'd become a monster herself. It never mentioned the secrets she carried to her grave, secrets that died with her because she'd been careful, methodical, lucky enough to avoid discovery for half a century. The house where it happened was demolished 5 years after her death, replaced by a modern apartment building where young families lived and children played, and no one knew the ground beneath them had once been soaked with blood. The Bogota River continued flowing, carrying its secrets to the ocean, giving up none of its mysteries. And somewhere in the city's vast archives, a file labeled Missing Person, Aurelio Tovar gathered dust, marked inactive, forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd ensured he'd never be found. This is the story of Maria Concepcion Ladino, who married a monster, became a monster to destroy him, and then spent the rest of her life trying to be human again. Whether she succeeded is a question without easy answers. But she survived, and sometimes survival is its own form of victory, its own kind of justice, its own terrible and beautiful ending. The truth is buried now, scattered like Aurelio's bones across a city that's forgotten both of them. But truth has a way of lingering, of existing in the spaces between official records and public knowledge. In stories whispered late at night when people discuss the things humans are capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. This was that story. This was that truth. And now you carry it too. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment, Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Predator of Picalia. A child's scream echoes where no one can hear it, and that's exactly how he planned it. Some monsters don't lurk in shadows. They build playgrounds to lure the innocent inside. We spend our lives believing that evil announces itself, that predators wear their darkness like a badge, that we'd recognize the face of a nightmare if it stood before us. But what happens when the monster is the one handing out candy? What happens when the devil himself is the man children run toward, not away from? Tonight, we descend into the twisted, suffocating world of Elver James Melcher Bannell, a man who weaponized trust, who turned innocence into prey, who transformed a quiet Colombian neighborhood into his personal hunting ground. This isn't just a story about a predator. This is a story about how an entire community was groomed, manipulated, and blinded while their children vanished into the hands of a man they called friend. Elver didn't hunt in darkness. He hunted in broad daylight, with a smile on his face and a pocket full of sweets. And by the time they realized what he truly was, it was far, far too late. Welcome to Picalina, where the predator didn't just take victims. He shattered an entire town's soul. Picalina wasn't supposed to be the kind of place where nightmares breed. Nestled on the outskirts of Ibague in Colombia's Tolima region, this working-class neighborhood hummed with the rhythms of ordinary life. Mothers calling children home for dinner, fathers returning from long shifts, street vendors hawking fresh fruit under the relentless sun. The streets were narrow, the houses packed close together, and everyone knew everyone. That was supposed to make them safe. That closeness, that familiarity, it was supposed to be their shield. But familiarity can be a weapon in the right hands. Elver James Melcher Bannell understood this better than anyone. While his neighbors saw a friendly, helpful man, someone who'd chat with the elderly, help carry groceries, wave at children playing soccer in the dusty streets, Elver was conducting an experiment in human blindness. He was testing just how much trust he could cultivate, how deeply he could embed himself into the social fabric before revealing his true nature. And the answer, as it turned out, was deeper than anyone could have imagined. He was 39 years old when his carefully constructed world began to collapse, but his predation had been refined over years, perhaps decades. Elver had mastered the art of camouflage, not by hiding, but by becoming hypervisible in all the wrong ways. He volunteered to watch children when parents needed a break. He handed out sweets and small coins to kids who crossed his path. He positioned himself as the neighborhood's unofficial uncle, the man who always had time for a smile, a joke, a moment of attention. Parents loved him, children adored him, and that was the trap. Elver's home became a landmark of sorts, a place where children felt welcome, where they could play video games, watch television, escape the boredom of their own cramped houses. He'd installed a small recreation area, stocked with toys and games that seemed almost too generous. Neighbors praised his kindness, his patience with the young ones. Some even envied his ability to connect with children, to make them laugh and feel heard. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see because Elver had spent years training them not to look, was the meticulous grooming process taking place behind closed doors. Every candy bar was a test of compliance. Every video game session was an opportunity to normalize his presence, to blur boundaries, to identify which children could be isolated, manipulated, threatened into silence. He studied them like a scientist studies specimens, noting which ones had absent parents, which ones were hungry for attention, which ones could be terrified into submission. The children of Picalina came in all shapes and struggles. Some lived in homes where violence was the primary language spoken between adults. Others had parents working multiple jobs, leaving them unsupervised for hours each day. Still others were simply young, naive, trusting, believers in the fundamental goodness of adults because that's what children are raised to believe. Elver identified every vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. He'd invite boys over, always boys, always between the ages of 8 and 14, and the visits would start innocently enough. A game of cards, a shared meal, television. But then the doors would lock, the curtains would close, and the monster would emerge from behind the mask. What happened in those moments is almost too horrific to articulate, but we must, because to sanitize evil is to dishonor its victims. Elver didn't simply abuse these children. He systematically broke them. He used a combination of threats, violence, and psychological manipulation to ensure their silence. He told them their families would be hurt if they spoke. He convinced them that no one would believe them. He framed his violations as something they had participated in willingly, planting seeds of shame and self-blame that would fester for years. Some children visited his house once and never returned, carrying their trauma in silence. Others were pulled back repeatedly, trapped in a cycle of abuse they couldn't escape. And through it all, the neighborhood remained blissfully, tragically ignorant. Because Elver was careful. He never rushed. He never got sloppy. He understood that the key to sustained predation wasn't just manipulating his victims. It was manipulating everyone around them. So he maintained his friendly facade, continued his neighborhood rounds, remained the helpful, harmless man everyone thought they knew. But children whispered among themselves, in hushed tones on street corners, in the back of classrooms, during recess at school. They shared fragments of stories. Don't go to his house. He's weird. Something bad happens there. These warnings circulated through the child world of Piccolina, an underground current of fear that never quite reached adult ears, because adults weren't listening. Adults were too busy trusting the pleasant man who always had a smile and a kind word. Years passed, the abuse continued, and the body count, not of deaths, but of shattered childhoods, grew steadily, silently, invisibly. By the time Elver was finally exposed, investigators would estimate that dozens of children had fallen victim to his predation. Dozens of families who'd sat at dinner tables mere feet from the house where their sons were being violated. Dozens of futures warped and darkened by a man who'd hidden in plain sight, protected not by shadows but by the very trust he'd spent years cultivating. The psychology of a predator like Elver is both complex and chillingly simple. Research into serial sexual offenders reveals a pattern. They're often charismatic, patient, methodical. They select environments where they have access and authority. They groom not just victims but entire communities, creating social capital that acts as a shield against suspicion. When someone is universally liked, accusations against them seem absurd, almost offensive. Not him, people say. He's such a good man. Elver understood this instinctively. He'd built himself an empire of goodwill, and he ruled it with an iron fist hidden in a velvet glove. But empires built on lies eventually crumble. And for Elver, the end began not with adult intervention, but with the courage of a child who decided that silence was worse than speaking. We don't know his name. He remains protected by Colombian law, as all child victims should be. But we know his story. We know that after suffering repeated abuse at Elver's hands, this boy finally found the strength to tell his mother what had happened. And we know that his mother, unlike so many others who dismissed their children's vague fears or strange behaviors, believed him. She believed him and she acted. The complaint was filed in early 2019. The local authorities in Ibague initially skeptical, because how could such a well-liked man be capable of such horrors? Began a preliminary investigation. They interviewed the boy. They interviewed his family. And slowly, carefully, they began approaching other families in the neighborhood. What they discovered was an avalanche of silence finally breaking. One boy came forward, then another, then 5 more, then 10. The stories were horrifyingly consistent. Invitations to Elver's house, locked doors, violent sexual assaults, threats to ensure silence. Some victims were as young as 8 years old. Some had been abused multiple times over years. All had carried their trauma in secret, convinced they were alone, convinced they wouldn't be believed. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police raided Elver's home and found evidence that confirmed the worst: photographs, videos, items that painted an undeniable picture of systematic, predatory abuse. The friendly neighbor, the helpful uncle, the kind man with candy in his pockets had been a monster wearing a human suit. As word spread through Piccolina, the community entered a state of collective shock and trauma. Parents who'd allowed their children to visit Elver's house felt crushing guilt. Neighbors who'd praised his kindness felt betrayed and horrified. The social fabric that had once seemed so tight-knit revealed itself to be full of holes. Holes through which children had fallen while adults looked the other way. Elver was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse, aggravated sexual assault, and other crimes related to his systematic predation of minors. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The testimony of his victims, though given in protected circumstances, as is proper for children, was damning and consistent. But perhaps most chilling was Elver's own response when confronted. He didn't deny the allegations. He didn't express remorse. According to investigators familiar with the case, he seemed almost proud of his ability to have deceived so many for so long. The mask had finally fallen, and beneath it was something cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of humanity. To understand the full scope of Elver's predation, we must examine the mechanisms he employed, the careful, calculated strategies that allowed him to operate for years without detection. Because this wasn't random violence. This wasn't crimes of opportunity. This was systematic, methodical evil conducted with the precision of an engineer. Predators like Elver don't emerge fully formed. They evolve, adapt, perfect their techniques through trial and error. And Elver had clearly been perfecting his approach for a very long time. The first tool in his arsenal was environmental selection. Piccolina wasn't chosen randomly. Working-class neighborhoods in Colombia face specific challenges: economic stress, limited law enforcement presence, parents working multiple jobs with little time for supervision. These aren't indictments of the families living there. They're simply realities of poverty and systemic inequality. But Elver recognized these conditions as fertile ground for predation. In wealthier neighborhoods, children are often shuttled between supervised activities, music lessons, sports practice, tutoring sessions. Their schedules are packed, their movements tracked. But in places like Piccolina, children have more freedom and less oversight. They play in the streets. They wander between houses. They're trusted to entertain themselves for hours at a time. This freedom, which should be a normal part of childhood, becomes a vulnerability when predators are present. Elver positioned himself at the center of this child world. His home became a hub, a gathering place, a destination. And once established, he began the careful process of normalizing boundary violations. Grooming is a term thrown around frequently in discussions of sexual predators, but it's worth unpacking what it actually means. Grooming isn't a single act. It's a process, often a lengthy one, designed to prepare a victim for abuse while simultaneously preparing the victim's environment to ignore warning signs. Stage 1. Elver identified potential victims by observing which children were most vulnerable: those seeking attention, those with absent or overwhelmed parents, those who seemed isolated from peers. He'd engage them with gifts, attention, and special treatment, making them feel chosen and valued. Stage 2. He'd establish private time with these children, creating scenarios where they'd be alone with him. This started publicly acceptable. Let him watch TV at my house while you run errands, and gradually shifted toward more isolated, private interactions. Stage 3, he'd begin testing boundaries. Inappropriate jokes, comments about their bodies, casual physical contact that lingered just slightly too long. These tests served dual purposes. They desensitized children to inappropriate behavior while also revealing which children would comply, which would question, which could be controlled through intimidation. Stage 4, escalation to sexual abuse. By this point, the child was thoroughly groomed, isolated, dependent on Elver's attention, convinced that what was happening was somehow their fault or their secret to keep. Stage 5, maintaining silence. This is where Elver's true cruelty emerged. He didn't just threaten his victims, he psychologically devastated them. He told boys that if they spoke, their families would be hurt or killed. He convinced them that they'd participated willingly and would be punished if authorities found out. He weaponized their shame, their fear, their love for their families against them. This process wasn't uniform. Elver adapted his approach to each victim's specific vulnerabilities, but the fundamental architecture remained consistent. Identify, isolate, groom, abuse, silence, repeat. What makes cases like this particularly insidious is the way predators groom not just victims but entire communities. Elver's public persona served a crucial function. It made accusations against him seem implausible. When a child exhibits behavioral changes, withdrawal, aggression, fear of specific people or places, regression in development, caregivers often notice but struggle to identify the cause. And if that child hints at or directly states that someone beloved by the community is responsible, the cognitive dissonance can be overwhelming. Not him. He's always been so kind. Are you sure you're remembering correctly? Maybe you misunderstood what happened. These responses, though well-intentioned, effectively silence victims and embolden predators. Elver had built such a strong reputation that even hints of his true nature were dismissed as impossible, allowing him to operate with near impunity. The physical space of his home also played a crucial role. Investigators who later examined the property found that Elver had created what essentially amounted to a trap. The recreation area with games and toys served as bait. But the layout of the house allowed him to quickly isolate children in interior rooms where screams wouldn't reach the street. Windows were covered. Doors could be locked from inside. He'd engineered his environment for predation as carefully as he'd engineered his public image. Evidence recovered from the home painted a horrifying picture of a man who documented his crimes. While the specific details of this evidence aren't publicly available, and rightly so, to protect victim identities, investigators confirmed finding materials that corroborated victim testimony and revealed the systematic nature of his abuse. But physical evidence alone doesn't capture the full horror. The psychological damage inflicted by Elver extends far beyond the moments of abuse. Child sexual abuse doesn't end when the assault ends. It reverberates through a victim's entire life, affecting their ability to trust, to form relationships, to feel safe in their own bodies. Many victims struggle with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. The abuse becomes a lens through which they view themselves and the world, often for decades. For the victims of Elver, the betrayal was particularly profound. He wasn't a stranger who grabbed them off the street. He was someone they knew, someone their parents trusted, someone the community celebrated. This type of abuse by a trusted figure, is especially damaging because it destroys a child's foundational understanding of the world. If someone so universally beloved could hurt them, then who can be trusted? If adults who were supposed to protect them didn't see or believe the danger, then who will keep them safe? These questions haunt survivors long after the physical abuse has ended. As the investigation into Elver progressed, a clearer picture emerged of the scope of his crimes. The initial complaint led to the identification of at least 15 confirmed victims, though investigators believed the true number was likely higher. Some families, overwhelmed by shame or fear, chose not to come forward. Some victims may not have recognized their experiences as abuse, a tragic but common occurrence when predators successfully convince children that the abuse was somehow normal or consensual. Each victim's testimony added another piece to the mosaic of Elver's predation. The stories were remarkably consistent in their basic structure. Trust exploited, boundaries violated, innocence stolen, silence enforced. But each story was also unique. An individual child's nightmare, a specific family's devastation. The legal process in Colombia for crimes of this nature is complex. Child testimony must be handled with extreme care to avoid re-traumatizing victims. Interviews are conducted by specially trained professionals in child-friendly environments. The goal is to gather necessary evidence while protecting the psychological well-being of children who have already suffered immensely. For Elver, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple victims with consistent stories, physical evidence from his home, his own statements when confronted. The case against him wasn't just strong, it was ironclad. But legal proceedings moved slowly, and for the victims and their families, every delay meant extended suffering. They wanted justice, They wanted Elver locked away where he could never hurt another child. They wanted acknowledgement that what happened to them was real, was wrong, was not their fault. The community of Piccolina grappled with its own reckoning. How had this happened under their noses? What signs had been missed? Could this happen again with a different predator? The trust that had once bound the neighborhood together now felt like naivety, and residents struggled with guilt, anger, and fear in equal measure. Town meetings were held. Support groups formed for affected families. Conversations about child safety, once conducted in vague terms, became explicit and urgent. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now kept them on much shorter leashes, hypervigilant for any sign of danger. This increased vigilance is understandable but also tragic. One of the casualties of Elver's crimes was the community's sense of safety and normalcy. Children's freedom was curtailed. Trust became a luxury few could afford. The social fabric was permanently altered, scarred by the knowledge of what evil had dwelt in their midst. Child safety experts emphasize that while vigilance is important, the goal shouldn't be to terrify children or make them suspicious of all adults. Instead, education, teaching children about body autonomy, about the difference between appropriate and inappropriate touching, about their right to say no even to adults, about the importance of telling trusted adults if something feels wrong is crucial. But these conversations are difficult, especially in communities where discussing sexuality or abuse is taboo. And Elver had exploited those taboos, operating in the silence created by discomfort and denial. The investigation also revealed systemic failures. Had anyone reported earlier suspicions that were dismissed? Had any children tried to tell adults who didn't listen? While specific details aren't publicly available, in virtually every case of long-term child abuse by trusted community members, there are retrospective warning signs that were either missed or ignored. This isn't to blame the community. Predators are skilled at manipulation, and hindsight is always clearer than real-time assessment. But it underscores the importance of creating environments where children feel safe reporting abuse and where adults take such reports seriously, even when they implicate people we trust and like. The arrest of Elver James Melcher Bannell sent shockwaves through Piccolina that registered far beyond the immediate neighborhood. News of the predator of Piccolina spread through Abeg, then throughout Tolima, then across Colombia. Media outlets picked up the story, though most reported responsibly, protecting victim identities while condemning the crimes. But for the families directly affected, media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it validated their suffering. This wasn't some minor incident to be quietly swept away. On the other hand, it meant their trauma became public property, discussed and dissected by strangers, sensationalized in ways that felt exploitative. The court proceedings, when they finally began, were conducted with appropriate protections for the child victims. Colombian law recognizes that requiring children to testify in open court, particularly about sexual abuse, can be deeply traumatizing. Instead, testimony is often given via recorded interviews conducted by psychologists and social workers, which are then presented in court. Elver, facing the weight of evidence against him, had few legal options. His defense attorneys attempted various strategies, questioning the reliability of child testimony, suggesting that the accusations were somehow coordinated or exaggerated, but these tactics rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Multiple independent victims telling consistent stories, physical evidence from his home, his own incriminating statements. The trial revealed details that made even seasoned prosecutors physically ill. The systematic nature of the abuse, the number of victims, the ages of the children, the duration of the predation. This wasn't a man who'd made a terrible mistake. This was a man who'd dedicated years of his life to harming children. Throughout the proceedings, Elver showed little emotion. Some observers interpreted this as remorselessness. Others suggested it might be dissociation or a defense mechanism. But regardless of his internal state, the external presentation was chilling. A man seemingly unmoved by the devastation he'd caused. Victim impact statements, while protected and often delivered through intermediaries to shield the children's identities, painted a harrowing picture of lives derailed. Children who'd once been outgoing became withdrawn, Students who'd excelled academically saw their grades plummet. Boys who'd enjoyed playing with friends began isolating themselves. Nightmares plagued their sleep. Trust became impossible. Touch became terrifying. And it wasn't just the direct victims who suffered. Their siblings witnessed their brothers' transformations without understanding why. Their parents struggled with crushing guilt. How had they not noticed? How had they allowed this to happen? Marriages strained under the weight of blame and grief. Some families were torn apart entirely, unable to navigate the trauma together. The broader community suffered its own collective trauma. Property values in the neighborhood declined. Who wants to live in the place known for a child predator? Families who'd lived in Piccolina for generations considered moving away, wanting to escape the stigma and the memories. The neighborhood itself became synonymous with horror, its name forever linked to Elver's crimes. But amid the darkness, there were glimmers of resilience. Support networks formed among the affected families. Therapy and counseling services, often provided at reduced or no cost by NGOs focused on child welfare, helped victims begin processing their trauma. Community members who'd previously been silent about their own childhood abuse came forward, creating intergenerational conversations about a topic long shrouded in shame. The criminal justice system, for all its flaws, delivered a verdict that reflected the severity of the crimes. Elver James Melcher Bannell was convicted on multiple counts of aggravated sexual abuse of minors and received a substantial prison sentence. In Colombia, such offenses can result in sentences of up to 60 years, and Elver received a sentence commensurate with the scope and severity of his crimes. But even this verdict, this acknowledgement of his guilt and this guarantee that he'd spend decades behind bars, couldn't undo the damage. The children he'd abused would carry those scars forever. The community he'd deceived would never fully recover its innocence. Prison, for predators like Elver, is often a dangerous place. Other inmates, even those who've committed serious crimes themselves, often view child abusers as the lowest form of criminal. There's an informal hierarchy in many prison systems where crimes against children are considered unforgivable and perpetrators are targeted for violence. While institutional justice may have been served, street justice, or rather cell block justice, is another matter entirely. Whether Elver faced such retribution isn't publicly documented, and perhaps doesn't matter. What matters is that he was removed from society, prevented from harming more children, and held accountable for his actions. The legal aftermath extended beyond Elver's conviction. Civil suits were filed by some families seeking damages. While money could never compensate for what was lost, it could help pay for therapy, for medical care, for the ongoing costs of helping a traumatized child heal. These cases often settled quietly, with terms sealed to protect victim privacy. There were also broader conversations about institutional responsibility. Should the local authorities have acted sooner? Were there systems in place that should have caught Elver earlier? How can communities better protect children without creating paranoia or destroying the social trust necessary for healthy neighborhoods to function? These are questions without easy answers. Child protection requires a delicate balance. Vigilance without hysteria, education without fear-mongering, accountability without witch hunts. And it requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Most child abuse is committed not by strangers, but by people children know and trust. Most predators don't look like monsters. They look like neighbors, teachers, coaches, family friends. This reality is terrifying because it means we can't simply teach children to fear strangers and call it protection. We must create environments where children understand body autonomy, where they know inappropriate touching is never their fault, where they feel empowered to say no and to tell trusted adults when something feels wrong. And crucially, we must ensure that when children do report abuse, they are believed and protected rather than dismissed or blamed. The cultural context matters here. In many Latin American communities, respect for adults and elders is deeply ingrained. Children are taught to obey, not to question. This cultural value, while generally positive, can be exploited by predators who use adult authority to silence victims. Shifting these dynamics. Teaching children that respect doesn't mean accepting harmful treatment, that they have a right to bodily autonomy even when dealing with respected adults, requires nuanced cultural conversations. Piccolina slowly began rebuilding in the aftermath of the case. New families moved in, often unaware of or choosing to overlook the neighborhood's dark history. The children who'd been victimized grew older, some receiving ongoing therapy and support, others struggling in silence because their families lacked resources or understanding. Some victims found purpose in advocacy, eventually speaking publicly, while protecting their identities, about their experiences to raise awareness about child sexual abuse. Their courage in transforming personal trauma into public education is remarkable. These are individuals who could have chosen to bury their pain but instead chose to ensure other children might be protected. Others simply tried to move on, to build lives that weren't defined by what Elver had done to them. Some succeeded. Others found that moving on from childhood sexual abuse is far more complicated than well-meaning adults sometimes suggest. Trauma doesn't follow a neat timeline. Healing isn't linear, and for many survivors, certain scars never fully fade. The psychological research on childhood sexual abuse recovery offers both hope and sobering realism. With proper support, therapy, family support, validation of their experiences, many survivors are able to build healthy, fulfilling lives. They form relationships, pursue careers, even become parents themselves, determined to break cycles and protect their own children. But the statistics also show elevated rates of mental health struggles, substance abuse, and other challenges among abuse survivors. The brain develops differently when exposed to severe trauma during childhood. Neural pathways associated with threat detection, emotional regulation, and trust can be permanently altered. This isn't a moral failing of survivors. It's a physiological reality of how trauma impacts development. Understanding this helps explain why the damage Elver caused extends so far beyond the moments of abuse themselves. He didn't just harm children physically. He altered the trajectory of their brain development, their psychological formation, their fundamental sense of safety in the world. And this, perhaps, is the truest measure of his monstrosity. Not the legal charges or the prison sentence, but the decades of suffering his victims would endure long after he was locked away. Years have passed since Elver's conviction, and the story of the predator of Piccolina has faded from national headlines. But for those who lived through it, the victims, their families, the community, the story never truly ends. Where are they now, these survivors? We can't know specifically, and we shouldn't. Their privacy must be protected. But we can understand their journeys through the broader research on abuse survivors and the few glimpses shared through advocate organizations working with the families. Some victims have thrived against the odds, finding healing through therapy, support networks, and their own remarkable resilience. They've completed their education, formed healthy relationships, pursued careers. They've learned to separate what was done to them from who they are. This doesn't mean the abuse doesn't affect them. It does, probably always will. But they've integrated that traumatic history into a broader life narrative that includes joy, success, and hope. Others have struggled more visibly. Statistics show that survivors of childhood sexual abuse face higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide attempts. Some of Elver's victims have undoubtedly walked these darker paths, battling demons he planted in their psyches years ago. Some may still be fighting those battles today. The families, too, remain fractured in many cases. Parents who once blamed themselves for missing warning signs or for trusting Elver carry guilt that may never fully dissipate. Marriages that couldn't withstand the strain of shared trauma ended in divorce. Siblings who didn't understand why their brother changed grew up with their own unresolved confusion and sometimes resentment. But there have also been stories of remarkable family resilience. Parents who educated themselves about trauma, who found the right therapists, who learned to listen without judgment and support without smothering. These families often become advocates themselves, working with organizations dedicated to child protection and abuse prevention. The community of Piccolina has transformed in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. There's a wariness now, a loss of the casual trust that once characterized the neighborhood. Parents are more vigilant about where their children go and with whom. Conversations about stranger danger have expanded to include discussions about trusted adults who might pose risks. The social fabric, once tight-knit perhaps to a fault, has been rewoven with different threads. Still connected, but with more visible boundaries, more explicit protections. Interestingly, crime data from the years following Elver's arrest show that Piccolina experienced a brief spike in reported suspicions and investigations of potential abuse, not necessarily indicating more abuse was occurring, but rather that the community had become hypersensitized to warning signs. This vigilance is a double-edged sword, protective but also potentially destructive if it leads to false accusations or collective paranoia. Child protection experts who've studied the case point to several critical lessons that extend far beyond this one neighborhood in Colombia. First, predators are expert manipulators of social trust. The stereotype of the creepy stranger lurking in playgrounds is not just inaccurate. It's dangerous because it directs attention away from the real threat. The vast majority of child sexual abuse is committed by someone the child knows. Elver's ability to become beloved by the community was a feature of his predation, not a contradiction of it. Second, grooming is a process, not an event. By the time overt abuse occurs, months or years of psychological manipulation have usually already happened. Teaching children to recognize grooming behaviors, adults who try to isolate them, who ask them to keep secrets from parents, who violate physical boundaries gradually, is crucial. Third, we must create environments where children feel safe reporting. Every child who stayed silent about Elver's abuse did so for reasons that made sense to them. Fear of not being believed, fear of getting in trouble, fear of their families being hurt, shame about what happened. Addressing these barriers requires both education, teaching children that abuse is never their fault, and demonstrating through action that adults will believe and protect them when they come forward. Fourth, community awareness must balance vigilance with avoiding panic. The goal isn't to make everyone paranoid about every interaction between adults and children. It's to create cultures of appropriate boundaries, respect for body autonomy, and openness about discussing uncomfortable topics. Fifth, supporting survivors is a long-term commitment. The immediate response when abuse is discovered, removing the perpetrator, providing emergency counseling, is just the beginning. Survivors need ongoing support, sometimes for years or decades. Mental health services, trauma-informed therapy, and survivor-led support groups are crucial resources that must remain available long after the initial crisis fades from public attention. The case also highlights systemic issues in how societies address child sexual abuse. In many countries, including Colombia, resources for child protection are limited, investigations are often slow, and support services for survivors are inadequate. These aren't failures of individual social workers or prosecutors, they're failures of political prioritization and resource allocation. Child advocacy organizations working in Colombia and internationally have used cases like Elver's to push for reforms. Better training for professionals who work with children, more funding for trauma therapy, stronger penalties for predators, and educational programs in schools about body safety and consent. Some of these reforms have been implemented. Others remain aspirational, blocked by budget constraints, cultural resistance, or political indifference. The fight to protect children is ongoing, complicated, and often frustrating. But cases like this one remind us why it's so critically important. There's also the question of prevention. Could Elver have been stopped earlier? In retrospect, probably yes. There were almost certainly warning signs, whispers among children, behavioral changes in victims that went unrecognized or unaddressed. But hindsight is always clearer than real-time assessment, and predators are skilled at exploiting the gaps in awareness and communication. The most promising prevention strategies focus on education, teaching children age-appropriate information about their bodies, about the difference between appropriate and inappropriate touch, about their right to say no to adults who make them uncomfortable. Teaching parents to watch for signs of grooming and abuse, not just dramatic behavioral changes, but subtle shifts in how their children interact with specific adults. Teaching communities to create cultures of accountability where concerning behaviors are addressed rather than excused. This is uncomfortable work. Many adults prefer to believe that childhood should be innocent, that discussing sexual abuse will somehow harm that innocence. But research consistently shows that age-appropriate education about body safety doesn't traumatize children. It empowers them, and that empowerment can be literally life-saving. The legacy of Elver James Melcher Bannell is one of incalculable harm. Lives derailed, childhood stolen, a community traumatized. No amount of justice can undo what he did. No prison sentence can give his victims back the innocence he took. But his legacy also includes the conversations his crimes sparked, the reforms his case helped push forward, the survivors who found their voices and used them to protect others. From unspeakable evil, there have emerged small but meaningful efforts to create better systems, safer communities, more informed and vigilant cultures of child protection. Elver sits in prison now, his name synonymous with predation, his freedom rightfully forfeited. Whether he feels remorse is unknown and, in many ways, irrelevant. His internal state doesn't change what he did or minimize the ongoing suffering of his victims. What matters is how we, as a society, respond to the knowledge that people like Elver exist. Do we turn away in discomfort, hoping it's an aberration that will never touch our communities? Or do we lean into that discomfort, educate ourselves, have difficult conversations, demand better protections, support survivors, and create environments where predators cannot operate with impunity? The children of Piccolina deserved better. They deserved a community that was as skilled at detecting predators as those predators are at camouflaging themselves. They deserved adults who listened to their whispered fears and took them seriously. They deserved a world where trust could exist without exploitation. We can't give them that world retroactively, but we can build it for the children growing up today. The final lesson from Piccolina is this: evil often wears a friendly face. It smiles at us in checkout lines, waves from across the street, offers help when we're struggling. It doesn't announce itself with ominous music or shadowy lurking. It integrates, ingratiates, becomes indispensable. And that's precisely what makes it so dangerous. Understanding Elver requires us to venture into deeply uncomfortable psychological territory. What creates a human being capable of such systematic harm to children? The question haunts researchers, psychologists, and criminologists who study sexual predators. Some point to developmental trauma cycles of abuse perpetuated across generations. Others identify neurological differences, abnormalities in brain regions associated with empathy and impulse control. Still others emphasize the role of cognitive distortions, the elaborate mental gymnastics predators employ to justify their actions. The child wanted it. I'm teaching them about love. This is special, not harmful. Elver's psychological profile, while not fully public, likely contained elements of all these factors. But understanding origins doesn't mean excusing actions. Many people experience trauma, neurological differences, or distorted thinking without becoming predators. At some point, many points actually, Elver made choices. He chose to view children as objects for his gratification. He chose to prioritize his desires over their well-being. He chose to methodically construct a system of predation rather than seeking help for his harmful urges. Those choices define him far more than any psychological diagnosis ever could. One aspect often overlooked in discussions of child sexual abuse is the impact on secondary victims, the people who loved and trusted the predator, who now must reconcile their positive experiences with him against the horror of his true nature. Imagine being a parent in Piccolina who'd frequently allowed your son to visit Elver's house, who'd thanked him for being so kind, who'd praised his patience with children. Now imagine learning what was really happening during those visits. The guilt would be crushing, potentially all-consuming. These parents are victims too, not of sexual abuse but of manipulation and betrayal. Many struggle with depression, anxiety, and their own form of PTSD. They replay memories, searching for signs they missed, torturing themselves with what-ifs and if-onlys. Some marriages and partnerships don't survive this strain. When both parents feel guilt, that guilt often transforms into blame, directed at themselves, at each other, at the universe for allowing such evil to flourish. Couples counseling records from families affected by child sexual abuse cases show patterns of communication breakdown, intimacy issues, and parenting conflicts that persist for years after the abuse is discovered. Siblings of victims face their own challenges. Younger siblings often don't fully understand what happened but sense the family's distress. Older siblings might understand too well and struggle with their own guilt for not protecting their brother. Some become overprotective, taking on parental roles inappropriate for their age. Others act out their behavioral problems a cry for attention in a family system now entirely focused on the identified victim. Extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, experience ripples of the trauma too. Family gatherings become minefields of unspoken tension. Some relatives blame the parents for not being vigilant enough, creating rifts that never fully heal. Others struggle with their own encounters with Elver, wondering if their friendly conversations with him somehow enabled his predation. Even neighbors who had no direct connection to the abuse often experience secondary trauma. The revelation that such evil existed in their midst, perhaps in the house next door, perhaps involving a man they chatted with countless times, shatters their sense of safety and judgment. If they couldn't recognize a predator when he was right in front of them, what else might they be missing? In the wake of Elver's case, Colombian child protection agencies conducted internal reviews to identify systemic failures. While specific findings aren't all publicly available, patterns emerged that are consistent with institutional responses to similar cases worldwide. One critical issue: the gap between suspicion and action. In many jurisdictions, there's a frustratingly high bar for investigating suspected child abuse. Vague concerns, behavioral changes, or children's indirect comments often don't trigger formal investigations. This is partly due to resource constraints. Child protective services are chronically underfunded and overwhelmed with cases. But it's also due to the difficulty of balancing family privacy rights against child protection imperatives. The result is that predators like Elver can operate in a gray zone, generating concern without triggering intervention for extended periods. By the time evidence becomes undeniable, significant harm has already occurred. Reforms proposed in response include lowering the threshold for investigation, making it easier to initiate inquiries when concerning patterns emerge, even if no single incident constitutes clear evidence of abuse. Mandatory reporting training, requiring teachers, coaches, clergy, and others who work with children to complete regular training on recognizing signs of abuse and grooming. Centralized tracking systems, creating databases that flag adults who interact with multiple children in different contexts, potentially revealing patterns that individual families or organizations wouldn't detect. Community education programs, implementing school-based and community-based education about child safety, not just for children but for parents and community members who need to understand how predators operate. These reforms face obstacles: privacy concerns, funding limitations, cultural resistance, but cases like Elver's provide the political will to push some changes through. Media coverage of child sexual abuse cases walks a difficult line. The public has a legitimate interest in understanding these crimes, both to protect their own children and to support policy reforms. But sensationalized coverage can cause additional harm to victims, perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and even inadvertently provide predators with blueprints for avoiding detection. Colombian media coverage of Elver's case was, by most accounts, relatively responsible. Victim identities were protected. Coverage focused on facts rather than salacious details. The emphasis remained on accountability and prevention rather than exploitation of trauma for ratings. But not all media outlets showed such restraint. International coverage, particularly in tabloid-style publications and on social media, often crossed ethical lines, speculating about victim identities, sharing unnecessary graphic details, framing the story as entertainment rather than tragedy. This sensationalism serves no one except media companies seeking clicks and views. For survivors, seeing their trauma commodified and sensationalized can be deeply re-traumatizing. For predators, detailed coverage of investigative techniques and victim behavior can inform future efforts to avoid detection. For communities, endless coverage keeps wounds open rather than allowing healing to progress. Responsible crime journalism, the kind that informs without exploiting, that centers victim well-being, that contributes to prevention rather than just satisfying curiosity, is possible but requires discipline and ethical commitment that not all media organizations possess. In recent years, there's been a powerful shift in how society discusses sexual abuse. Rather than speaking about survivors in passive terms, as permanently damaged, as defined by their victimization, there's increasing recognition of survivors' agency, resilience, and expertise. Some of Elver's victims, now young adults, have chosen to speak publicly while protecting their identities about their experiences. Their testimonies, shared through advocacy organizations and in therapeutic contexts, reveal both the deep harm caused by abuse and the remarkable capacity for human resilience. One survivor, speaking anonymously to a Colombian advocacy group, described his journey. "For years, I let what happened to me be the only story about my life. I was the boy who was abused, and everything else about me disappeared behind that label. Healing meant learning that I'm also a student, a friend, a soccer player, a son, a person with dreams and talents. What happened to me is part of my story, but it's not the whole story." This reframing, from victim identity to survivor identity to whole person identity, represents crucial psychological progress. It doesn't minimize the harm or suggest that survivors should just move on. Instead, it recognizes that humans are complex, that we can hold trauma and joy simultaneously, that recovery is about integration rather than erasure. Another survivor spoke about the power of breaking silence. "When I finally told my story to other people who'd been through similar things, I realized I wasn't alone. All those years I thought I was the only one, that something was wrong with me specifically. Understanding that predators follow patterns, that what happened to me happened to others too, somehow made it less about my personal failure and more about his calculated evil. That shift saved my life." These voices, survivors reclaiming their narratives, speaking their truths, demanding systemic change, represent the most powerful form of resistance against predators like Elver. Every survivor who speaks up makes it slightly easier for the next victim to come forward, slightly harder for the next predator to operate in silence. Piccolina remains vigilant, perhaps hypervigilant, in the years since Elver's conviction. But vigilance alone isn't sufficient protection, and no community is immune to predation. The uncomfortable truth is that yes, it could happen again. In Piccolina, in your neighborhood, in any community where children and adults interact. Because predators will always exist, and they will always seek positions of trust and access to vulnerable populations. But "it could happen again" doesn't mean we're helpless. It means we must remain committed to the unglamorous, ongoing work of prevention, educating children about body autonomy and consent from age-appropriate developmental stages, teaching them that they have the right to say no to adults, that secrets about touching are never okay, that they should tell a trusted adult if someone makes them uncomfortable, and keep telling until someone listens. Training adults who work with children to recognize grooming behaviors and boundary violations. Creating clear policies about one-on-one interactions between adults and minors. Implementing background checks and reference checks that dig deeper than surface-level confirmations. Building community cultures where child safety is prioritized over adult comfort. This means being willing to have awkward conversations, to question behavior that seems off even when it involves people we like, to prioritize children's safety over preserving social harmony. Supporting survivors not just immediately after abuse is discovered, but years and decades later, when ongoing therapy, support groups, and accommodation for trauma-related challenges remain necessary. Advocating for policy changes that allocate adequate resources to child protection services, that create accountability for institutions that fail to protect children in their care, that ensure predators face consequences proportionate to the harm they cause. Drive through Piccolina today, and you'll see a neighborhood that looks much like any other working-class community in Colombia. Children play in the streets. Families go about their daily routines. Life continues, but speak to longtime residents, particularly those who remember the Elver years, and you'll hear a different story. They'll tell you about the invisible memorial that exists in their collective memory, a reminder of what was lost and what was learned. Some speak of the neighborhood's trauma with a sense of shame, as if Elver's crimes somehow reflect poorly on all of them. Others frame it differently, as a painful but important lesson that galvanized the community to be more protective, more aware, more willing to act on suspicions. The children who were Elver's victims are adults now, navigating their 20s and 30s with varying degrees of success and struggle. Some have left Piccolina, seeking fresh starts in places not haunted by their childhood trauma. Others have stayed, reclaiming the streets where they once played, refusing to let Elver's evil drive them from their home. Their parents are older, grayer, carrying weights that will never fully lift. Some have found peace through faith, therapy, or the passage of time. Others remain trapped in cycles of guilt and what-ifs. The diversity of their responses reflects the complexity of trauma. There is no single path to healing, no timeline that applies to everyone. And Elver, he remains incarcerated, his name now synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. Whether he reflects on his crimes with remorse or self-justification, we cannot know. But in the end, his internal state matters far less than the external reality. He has been stopped, removed from society, prevented from harming more children. That is justice, imperfect but real. The story of Elver James Melcher Bannell forces us to confront truths that our minds naturally resist. Evil is often banal, not theatrical. Predators don't cackle villainously or lurk in obvious shadows. They coach little league, they work in schools, they live next door and wave pleasantly as you walk past. Trust, while essential for functioning communities, can be weaponized. The same social bonds that create connection and support can also create vulnerability when exploited by malicious actors. Children are simultaneously resilient and fragile. They can survive horrific trauma and go on to build meaningful lives. But they shouldn't have to. Their resilience is remarkable but should never be necessary. Silence protects predators. Every conversation we avoid about sexual abuse, every time we dismiss a child's concern because it's uncomfortable to consider, every moment we prioritize adult reputation over child safety, we create space for predators to operate. Justice, while important, is not the same as healing. Elver's conviction was necessary but not sufficient. The ongoing support of survivors, the prevention of future abuse, the repair of community trust, these are separate, equally crucial tasks. As this story ends, we're left not with closure but with responsibility. The responsibility to carry these lessons forward, to apply them in our own communities, to protect the children in our own circles of influence. We're left with the knowledge that monsters are real, that they often wear the most disarming disguises, that eternal vigilance is not paranoia but prudence. And we're left with a choice: to turn away from these uncomfortable truths, to pretend that evil only exists in distant places or extreme cases, or to lean into our discomfort and do the hard work of creating genuinely safer spaces for children. The children of Piccolina couldn't make that choice. They were betrayed by the adults whose job it was to protect them. But we can. We must. Because somewhere, right now, another predator is building trust, grooming victims, exploiting the silence and discomfort that surrounds child sexual abuse. And the only thing standing between that predator and their next victim is us. Our awareness, our vigilance, our courage to see clearly even when it's easier to look away, our commitment to believing children even when they accuse people we trust. The predator of Piccolina was stopped, but the fight to protect children never ends. It continues in every conversation we have with our children about body safety. In every uncomfortable moment when we choose to question concerning behavior instead of explaining it away. In every policy we support that prioritizes child protection over institutional reputation. In every survivor we believe, support, and stand beside as they navigate their healing. Elver's story is specific: one man, one neighborhood, one horrific pattern of abuse. But the lessons are universal. The question is, will we learn them? Or will we wait until another Piccolina forces us to confront, once again, the evil that hides in plain sight? The children are watching, waiting to see if we're worthy of their trust. Let's prove that we are. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Angel of Death. They say heaven has angels, but hell sends its own messengers too. There are monsters who hide in shadows, and then there are monsters who wear white coats and healing hands. Hernando Arturo Prada didn't lurk in dark alleys or abandoned warehouses. He walked hospital corridors where the fluorescent lights hummed their sterile lullabies, where families whispered prayers, where the dying clutched at hope with trembling fingers. He was trusted, revered, a physician sworn to preserve life. But behind those calm eyes and gentle bedside manner lived something that should never have been allowed to draw breath. Between 1977 and 1978, in the sprawling medical centers of Venezuela, patients who should have recovered never opened their eyes again. The sick who came seeking mercy found only darkness. And the man they called doctor, the man whose very presence should have meant salvation, became their executioner. This is the story of Hernando Arturo Prada, the Venezuelan physician who turned healing into horror, who transformed hospitals into hunting grounds, and who earned a title that still makes seasoned investigators shudder. The Angel of Death, Caracas, Venezuela, 1977. The city breathed with the rhythm of progress and possibility. Modern hospitals rose like monuments to medical advancement, their glass facades reflecting sunlight and hope. Inside these institutions, doctors moved with purpose, nurses monitored vital signs, and families waited in corridors, clinging to faith that medicine would deliver their loved ones from the edge of oblivion. Hernando Arturo Prada walked among them, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a symbol of authority. To the casual observer, he embodied everything a physician should be: attentive, knowledgeable, composed. His voice carried the reassuring timbre that made frightened patients exhale their anxiety. When he entered a room, visitors relaxed. When he smiled, families believed their nightmares would end. But something else moved behind that professional facade, something ancient and hungry, something that had learned to camouflage itself in compassion's clothing. Prada had come from humble origins, ascending through medical school with determination that impressed his instructors. He absorbed anatomical knowledge with unsettling precision, memorizing every pathway through the human body, every vulnerable point where life could be extinguished with the slightest intervention. His professors praised his clinical detachment, never suspecting that what they mistook for professional objectivity was actually the cold calculation of a predator studying prey. The hospital where Prada worked served thousands. Patients arrived in ambulances, their bodies ravaged by disease, their systems compromised by age or accident. They came believing they would be protected, never imagining that danger wore a physician's face. The emergency department pulsed with controlled chaos. Monitors beeping, gurneys rushing past, voices calling for assistance. And somewhere in that organized pandemonium, Prada found his opportunity. His first known victim arrived on a stretcher, barely conscious, struggling to breathe. The medical team worked efficiently, establishing 4 lines, administering oxygen, performing the delicate choreography that separates life from death. Prada observed, waiting. He understood hospital rhythms, knew when attention shifted elsewhere, recognized the moments when he could act without witnesses. Later that night, when corridors emptied and exhaustion dulled the vigilance of overworked staff, Prada entered the patient's room. The monitoring equipment cast its green glow across the unconscious form. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse answered a call button. Somewhere else, a doctor reviewed charts. And in that room, in those stolen minutes, Prada reached for the 4 line. What happened next took less than 60 seconds. His fingers moved with surgical precision, adjusting the medication drip, introducing substances that should never have entered a healing environment. He watched as the patient's breathing changed, as the body began its involuntary response to sudden chemical disruption. The monitors registered distress, but not immediately, not fast enough to summon help before the damage became irreversible. By the time the code team arrived, rushing in with defibrillators and emergency protocols, Prada had already stepped back, his expression arranged in appropriate concern. He participated in the resuscitation attempts, his hands moving through the motions while his mind cataloged what had worked, what needed refinement for next time. The patient died at 3:47 a.m. The death certificate listed natural causes, a complication of the underlying condition. The family grieved. The hospital recorded another loss in its statistics. And Hernando Prada walked away already thinking about tomorrow. The second killing came easier. The third easier still. Prada developed a methodology, a system that allowed him to move through his murderous routine with the same efficiency he applied to legitimate medical procedures. He studied patient charts with predatory focus, identifying those whose deaths would raise the fewest questions: the elderly, the terminally ill, those whose bodies had already been ravaged by disease. But sometimes he deviated from his pattern, selecting victims whose deaths would shock, whose sudden deterioration would leave medical staff bewildered. These were the cases that gave him particular satisfaction, the ones that demonstrated his power over life's most fundamental boundary. He became an expert in what forensic investigators would later call medical camouflage, the art of making murder look like medical misfortune. He understood which drugs left minimal traces, which interventions could trigger cascading system failures that mimicked natural death. He knew how to manipulate oxygen levels, how to induce sudden cardiac events, how to make a patient's own body become the instrument of their demise. The hospital's mortality rate began climbing, but slowly, incrementally, never quite reaching the threshold that would trigger administrative alarm. Deaths occurred across different departments, different shifts, following no obvious pattern that would point to a single cause or individual. Prada had learned from the mistakes of other medical killers, those who had created obvious clusters of death that invited investigation. He varied his methods. Sometimes he used medications, pushing syringes of lethal substances into 4 ports, watching as chemical death flowed into unsuspecting veins. Other times he employed physical interventions, smothering patients when opportunity arose, disrupting oxygen supplies, triggering acute medical crises through calculated acts of violence disguised as treatment. One elderly woman, hospitalized for pneumonia, had been improving steadily. Her lungs were clearing, her fever had broken, and her daughters had begun discussing discharge plans. Prada examined her chart, noting her progress with cold displeasure. That evening, after visiting hours ended, he returned to her room. She opened her eyes when he entered, managing a weak smile, trusting. He adjusted her medication without speaking, his movements casual, unhurried. Within 20 minutes, her respiratory system began failing. The crash cart arrived. The team worked desperately, but the damage had already spread too far. Her daughters arrived to find their mother's body still warm, her hands still soft, her unexpected death incomprehensible. A middle-aged man, recovering from routine surgery, never saw Prada enter his room at midnight. The patient was sleeping, his body healing, his prognosis excellent. Prada stood over him in the darkness, studying the vulnerable form. Then his hands moved to the oxygen mask, applying pressure where pressure should never exist, maintaining that terrible contact until the struggling stopped. The official report listed sudden respiratory failure. The surgeon who had performed the operation questioned the outcome. His procedure had been flawless, the patient stable. But death sometimes defies explanation in medical settings, and without evidence of foul play, the case was closed. A young woman, admitted with complications from diabetes, should have responded to treatment. Instead, her condition deteriorated rapidly, her body spiraling into crisis despite aggressive intervention. The endocrinologist treating her couldn't understand the cascade of failures. The insulin levels made no sense. The metabolic chaos suggested something beyond the original diagnosis. She died confused and frightened, calling for her mother, her final moments filled with pain that no medication seemed to relieve, because the medication meant to relieve suffering never reached her. Prada had ensured that, altering her treatment regimen in ways that would only become apparent to someone looking for deliberate harm. Through it all, Prada maintained his professional demeanor. He attended staff meetings, discussed patient care with colleagues, participated in case reviews. He expressed appropriate sadness when patients died, offered condolences to grieving families, and even attended memorial services, standing among mourners with bowed head, hiding satisfaction behind a mask of sympathy. His colleagues noticed nothing suspicious. If anything, they considered him exceptionally dedicated, frequently staying late, volunteering for additional shifts. Some nurses commented on how often he checked on patients who weren't even assigned to him, interpreting this as conscientiousness rather than predatory surveillance. But one nurse had begun to notice something else: patterns, coincidences, the way certain patients seemed to take sudden turns for the worse after Prada had been alone with them. She said nothing at first, dismissing her concerns as paranoia, as imagination fueled by exhaustion. Medical professionals are trained to trust each other, to assume competence and good faith. Suspecting a colleague of deliberately harming patients requires overcoming powerful psychological resistance. Yet the deaths continued, and her unease grew. She started keeping informal notes, documenting which patients died during which shifts, which physician had been present. The pattern that emerged made her hands shake. But she had no proof, only intuition and circumstantial observation. And accusing a doctor of murder based on intuition could destroy her career if she was wrong. While she wrestled with her suspicions, Prada continued his work. Each death refined his technique. Each successful killing increased his confidence. He had discovered something terrible about himself, that he enjoyed this. Not just the act of killing, but the power it represented, the godlike authority over who lived and who died. He would later tell investigators that he felt nothing during the murders themselves, that the deaths were simply necessary, that he was somehow improving the victims' situations, releasing them from suffering. But those who studied his case would recognize these explanations as rationalization, the lies that killers tell themselves to justify inexcusable actions. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Hernando Prada killed because he wanted to, because he could, because somewhere in the development of his psyche, something fundamental had broken or never properly formed, leaving him capable of atrocities that normal human conscience would never permit. As 1977 drew toward its end, Prada had already claimed at least 20 lives. The exact number would never be known with certainty. Many deaths had been cremated, their bodies transformed to ash before questions arose. Others had been attributed so completely to natural causes that no one thought to investigate further. But the nurse who had been watching, whose instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, finally decided to act. She approached a hospital administrator, voice shaking, presenting her documentation of suspicious deaths. The administrator listened with growing alarm. An investigation was quietly launched, and Hernando Prada, the angel of death, had no idea that his sanctuary was about to become his prison, that the hospital corridors where he had hunted freely were about to close around him like the bars of a cage. The horror was far from over, but the beginning of the end had finally arrived. The investigation began with whispers. Hospital administrators, terrified of scandal and potential lawsuits, moved with excruciating caution. They couldn't simply accuse a physician without substantial evidence. The professional and legal ramifications would be catastrophic if they were wrong. But they also couldn't ignore the mounting documentation that suggested something monstrous was happening within their walls. They started by pulling patient records, cross-referencing death certificates with duty rosters, mapping the temporal landscape of unexplained mortality. What they discovered made seasoned administrators go pale. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it. When Prada worked, death rates spiked. During his shifts, patients with stable conditions suddenly destabilized. In his wake, a trail of bodies accumulated that defied statistical probability. But patterns alone wouldn't convict anyone. They needed concrete evidence of criminal action, proof that would survive legal scrutiny. The hospital brought in outside medical experts to review cases, sworn to secrecy, tasked with determining whether these deaths could be explained by natural causes or medical error. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience, spent 3 weeks reviewing files in a locked office. She examined autopsy reports, toxicology screens, medication records, and nursing notes. With each passing day, her expression grew darker. She had investigated suspicious hospital deaths before, but nothing had prepared her for what she was uncovering here. The sophistication disturbed her most. Whoever was responsible understood medicine intimately, knew exactly how to trigger system failures that would mimic natural death. In some cases, the methods were elegant in their terrible efficiency. A slight increase in medication here, a deliberate omission there, small interventions that cascaded into catastrophic outcomes. She identified 7 cases where death had occurred with unusual rapidity despite positive prognosis. In 4 of those cases, toxicology had detected unexpected substances in blood samples, compounds that shouldn't have been present given the documented treatment protocols. Someone had been administering medications off the record, introducing chemical agents that had no therapeutic purpose. Dr. Vasquez prepared her report with meticulous care. Her conclusions were damning. Multiple deaths appeared consistent with deliberate medical intervention designed to hasten mortality. She recommended immediate law enforcement involvement. The hospital contacted Venezuela's investigative police. Detectives arrived quietly, dressed in civilian clothes, blending with the stream of visitors and consultants that moved through the building daily. They set up surveillance, watching staff members, particularly those who matched the suspicious patterns. Prada noticed nothing unusual at first. He continued his routine, selecting victims, waiting for opportunities, delivering death with practiced efficiency. But the net was tightening. A 36-year-old father of 3, admitted for appendicitis, underwent successful surgery. His recovery proceeded normally for 2 days. On the third night, Prada appeared at his bedside. The patient, groggy from pain medication but conscious, would later describe what happened with confused terror. Prada had injected something into his foreline, something that wasn't on his chart, wasn't prescribed by his surgeon. The patient felt immediate wrongness flooding his system. Burning pain, difficulty breathing, cardiac palpitations that felt like his chest might explode. He managed to hit the call button before losing consciousness. Nurses arrived within seconds, finding the patient in acute distress. They initiated emergency protocols, and this time, crucially, they had enough warning to counteract whatever had been administered. The patient survived, though barely. And when investigators questioned him, when they showed him photographs of hospital staff, his trembling finger pointed directly at Hernando Prada. The trap was set. Detectives decided to catch Prada in the act, to create a situation where his actions would be undeniable. They established surveillance in a patient's room. A terminally ill elderly man who had consented to help capture whoever was killing hospital patients. Cameras were hidden, recording equipment installed, and a team of officers waited nearby, ready to intervene. Prada took the bait. Late on a February evening in 1978, he entered the room where the elderly man lay. The cameras captured everything. His furtive glance toward the doorway, his approach to the forestand, the syringe he removed from his pocket, filled with a substance that would later be identified as a massive dose of potassium chloride, a drug that would stop the heart almost immediately. As Prada connected the syringe to the foreport, officers burst through the door. He spun, shock registering across his features for the first time. The mask of professional composure shattered. For a moment, they saw what his victims had seen in their final seconds: cold calculation, predatory focus, complete absence of empathy. He tried to run. 2 officers tackled him before he reached the corridor. The syringe fell, rolling across the sterile floor, its lethal contents glinting under harsh hospital lights. Prada struggled, shouting that they were making a mistake, that he was trying to help the patient, that they didn't understand. But the video evidence was irrefutable, and once authorities had him in custody, the full scope of his crimes began emerging like a cancer revealed during exploratory surgery. Under interrogation, Prada initially maintained his innocence. He was a healer, he insisted, a physician dedicated to relieving suffering. The authorities had manufactured a case against him, misinterpreted his actions, failed to understand the complexities of medical treatment. But as evidence mounted, testimonies from surviving victims, toxicology reports, timeline analyses showing the correlation between his shifts and unusual deaths, his defenses crumbled. After 72 hours of questioning, exhaustion and psychological pressure finally broke through his resistance. He began to talk. What he described chilled even veteran homicide investigators. Prada admitted to at least 23 murders, though he characterized them as mercy killings, as acts of compassion for patients who were suffering. This rationalization was immediately recognized as the self-serving delusion it was. Many of his victims had been recovering, on paths toward resuming normal lives. The 78-year-old woman who died gasping for breath had been scheduled for discharge the next day. The 42-year-old accountant whose heart stopped had been days away from returning to his family. The 19-year-old girl who suffered sudden renal failure had been expected to make a complete recovery from her infection. These were not mercy killings. These were murders. Prada described his methods with disturbing clinical precision. He explained how potassium chloride, when injected rapidly, caused immediate cardiac arrest that was nearly impossible to distinguish from natural sudden death. He detailed how he used insulin overdoses to induce fatal hypoglycemia in diabetic patients. He outlined the suffocation techniques he employed, applying pressure to airways in ways that left minimal physical evidence. He talked about selecting victims, about the criteria he used. The vulnerable attracted him, those too weak to resist, too compromised to call for help quickly enough. But sometimes he chose victims specifically because they were getting better, because killing them would be more challenging, would test his skills more thoroughly. One investigator asked him how he felt during the murders. Prada paused, considering the question with the same analytical detachment he might apply to a diagnostic puzzle. "Nothing," he finally answered. "I felt nothing at all." That absence of emotion, that complete void where empathy should exist, told investigators everything they needed to know about who they were dealing with. Prada wasn't simply a criminal. He was something more fundamentally broken, a human being whose internal moral architecture had never properly developed or had been destroyed so completely that nothing recognizable remained. The investigation expanded beyond Prada's direct confessions. Authorities exhumed bodies where possible, conducting fresh autopsies with specific attention to signs of foul play. In several cases, forensic pathologists found evidence consistent with Prada's described methods: tissue damage patterns suggesting suffocation, chemical traces indicating medication overdoses, physiological changes that now made terrible sense. Families of victims were contacted, informed that their loved ones hadn't died from disease or natural causes, but had been murdered by the physician entrusted with their care. The psychological devastation was immeasurable. Parents who had buried children, spouses who had lost partners, children who had mourned parents, all learned that their grief had been compounded by betrayal, that the hands meant to heal had instead delivered death. Some families demanded answers. Why their loved one? What possible reason could Prada have had? The explanations they received offered no comfort. There was no reason, no logic that normal minds could process. Their family members had simply been convenient targets for a predator who killed because something inside him was profoundly, irreparably wrong. The legal proceedings began. Prada was charged with 23 counts of first-degree murder, though prosecutors suspected the true number of victims was higher. Perhaps 30, perhaps 40, perhaps even more. The exact tally would never be known. Too many bodies had been cremated, too much time had passed, too many deaths had been accepted without question. The trial became a media sensation. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the angel of death, the physician who had perverted his oath to preserve life. Television coverage showed Prada being escorted into court, his head down, hands cuffed, looking smaller and more ordinary than anyone expected. Monsters, the public learned, don't always appear monstrous. Witnesses testified. The nurse who had first noticed the pattern described her growing horror as the evidence accumulated. Surviving victims recounted their near-death experiences, their voices breaking as they described Prada standing over them with syringes of poison. Medical experts explained exactly how each method worked, how each victim had died, the suffering that had accompanied their final moments. Prada's defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting their client suffered from mental illness that impaired his judgment. Psychiatric evaluators rejected this completely. Prada knew exactly what he was doing. He understood his actions were illegal and wrong. He had taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection. This was premeditated, calculated murder, repeated dozens of times. The prosecution painted a portrait of a serial killer who had exploited his position for predatory purposes. They showed the jury timeline analyses, death certificates, toxicology reports. They brought in family members who testified about vibrant, living people who had entered the hospital expecting treatment and had left in coffins. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Prada showed no reaction. His face remained blank, empty of emotion, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else entirely. Victims' families wept. Some shouted their hatred across the courtroom. Prada simply stared forward, present in body but seemingly absent in any meaningful way. The sentencing phase would determine whether he faced execution or life imprisonment. But regardless of the ultimate punishment, one truth was inescapable. Hernando Arturo Prada had transformed hospitals from sanctuaries of healing into hunting grounds for human prey, and the trust that should exist between physician and patient had been violated in ways that would leave scars for generations. As the sentencing phase commenced, prosecutors faced a critical decision. Should they seek the death penalty for Hernando Prada? The crimes were undeniably heinous. He had murdered at least 23 people, likely more, violating the most sacred trust that exists in medicine. But Venezuela's legal system grappled with complex questions about capital punishment, about whether the state should kill killers, about what justice truly meant. The prosecution decided to pursue the maximum penalty. They would present evidence of aggravating factors, the vulnerability of victims, the abuse of professional position, the premeditated nature of the crimes, the sheer number of lives destroyed. They would ask the court to ensure Prada could never hurt anyone again. But before sentencing, the court allowed additional testimony. And what emerged during this phase revealed depths of depravity that even seasoned legal professionals found difficult to comprehend. Investigators had continued their work, interviewing Prada extensively, trying to understand not just what he had done but why. Serial killers often develop internal narratives that explain their actions, psychological frameworks that allow them to continue functioning despite committing acts that would destroy normal conscience. Prada was no exception. During one interview, he was asked about specific victims. The interrogator presented photographs, medical records, details about the people whose lives he had ended. As Prada looked at each image, he offered commentary that revealed the true horror of his psychology. The 67-year-old grandmother who had been recovering from hip surgery, Prada remembered her clearly. She had been cheerful, optimistic, talking about her grandchildren's upcoming visit. He had entered her room at 2 a.m., adjusted her medication drip, and watched as her breathing became labored. She had woken briefly, confusion and fear in her eyes, reaching weakly toward the call button. He had moved it out of reach, then waited. The death took 14 minutes. He described this with the same tone someone might use to explain a routine procedure, devoid of emotional content. The 29-year-old teacher, hospitalized with pneumonia, whose parents had been sleeping in the waiting room when she died. Prada recalled her as well. She had been reading a book when he entered, had looked up and smiled, recognizing him from earlier rounds. He had told her he was checking her for, that everything was fine. She had returned to her book, trusting. He injected potassium chloride into her line and left the room. The cardiac arrest came within minutes. Her parents had rushed in to find her already gone, the book fallen across her chest, her eyes still open. The 55-year-old engineer who had survived a heart attack and was in cardiac rehabilitation. Prada had selected him specifically because killing someone whose heart was already compromised presented interesting challenges. He had to be careful, had to make the death appear as if the original condition had simply proven too severe. He had introduced a medication interaction that triggered a massive coronary event. The man had died clutching his chest, calling for help that came too late, his recovery stolen by the physician who should have been ensuring it. Listening to these descriptions, investigators realized they were dealing with something beyond typical criminal psychology. Prada exhibited characteristics of what psychiatrists call malignant narcissism combined with sadistic personality traits. He viewed his victims not as human beings but as objects, as problems to be solved, as opportunities to exercise power. One psychologist who evaluated him noted that Prada seemed to derive satisfaction not from the deaths themselves but from the deception, from the knowledge that he was fooling everyone around him. Each successful murder reinforced his sense of superiority, his belief that he was operating on a level that others couldn't perceive or understand. Additional victims emerged during this investigative period. A 48-year-old chef who had been admitted for routine hernia surgery had died unexpectedly 3 days post-operation. The death had been attributed to surgical complications, but reviewing the case with fresh eyes revealed inconsistencies. Medication records showed substances that hadn't been prescribed. Timing of the fatal event corresponded with Prada's shift. The chef's widow was contacted and informed that her husband's death was now considered murder. An 82-year-old retired professor, hospitalized with dehydration, had been improving steadily when his kidneys suddenly failed. Medical staff had been baffled. The treatment should have worked. Fresh analysis suggested deliberate intervention, likely manipulation of fluid and electrolyte balances in ways designed to trigger renal crisis. Another family received the devastating news that their loved one had been murdered. The scope kept expanding. Every case where death had occurred during Prada's tenure was reviewed. Some proved to be natural deaths, unrelated to his presence. But others began revealing their terrible secrets. Tissue samples that had been stored showed chemical traces that shouldn't exist. Timeline analyses exposed impossible medication sequences. Nursing notes, when read with suspicion rather than trust, documented subtle irregularities that now made horrifying sense. By the time investigators finished their work, they believed Prada had killed at least 35 people, possibly more than 40. The true number would never be known with certainty. Too many victims had been cremated. Too much evidence had been destroyed. Too many deaths had been accepted without question during a time when no one suspected a physician could be systematically murdering patients. The sentencing hearings became forums for victims' families to address their pain directly to Prada. One by one, they stood before the court, voices shaking with grief and rage, describing the people he had killed, the lives he had destroyed. A woman in her 30s spoke about her father, the 59-year-old postal worker who had been her hero, who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with homework and walked her down the aisle at her wedding. He had gone into the hospital for a routine procedure, had called her the night before he died to say he was feeling good, that he'd be home soon. Instead, Prada had ended his life, had stolen all the years he should have had, all the moments with grandchildren he would never meet. A man in his 60s, voice breaking, described his wife of 40 years. She had been his best friend, his constant companion. Her hospital stay was supposed to be brief, a minor issue requiring short-term care. Then came the midnight phone call, the impossible words, "Your wife has passed away." He had lived 2 years since then, he told the court, but he had died that night too. Part of him was gone forever, murdered along with the woman he loved. A young mother spoke about her 5-year-old son's questions. "Where is Nana?" he asked repeatedly. "When is Nana coming back?" How did she explain to a child that Nana was never coming back, that the doctor who was supposed to help her had killed her instead? How did she explain evil to someone too young to comprehend that such things exist? Through all of this, Prada sat motionless. His expression remained neutral, disconnected, as if he were observing events happening to someone else. Psychologists noted that even when confronted directly with the suffering he had caused, he showed no genuine emotional response. Whatever allows humans to feel empathy, to connect with others' pain, was absent or so damaged as to be non-functional. The defense, desperate for any mitigating factor, presented witnesses who testified about Prada's troubled childhood. His father had been abusive, they argued, creating psychological trauma that had damaged his ability to form normal human connections. His mother had died when he was 12, leaving him without positive attachment figures during critical developmental years. The prosecution countered that thousands of people experience difficult childhoods without becoming serial killers. Trauma might explain some behavioral issues, some psychological challenges, but it didn't excuse or justify the systematic murder of dozens of innocent people. Prada had made choices. He had repeatedly chosen to kill when he could have chosen differently. Medical experts testified about hospital serial killers, a distinct category of murderers who exploit healthcare settings. Studies showed that such killers often shared certain characteristics: desire for power and control, enjoyment of deception, narcissistic personality traits, and ability to compartmentalize their actions. Prada fit the profile perfectly. Dr. Vasquez, the forensic pathologist who had first documented the suspicious patterns, returned to the stand. She described the medical sophistication required to commit these crimes, the detailed knowledge of pharmaceuticals and physiology that Prada had weaponized. "He didn't stumble into these murders," she testified. "He planned them. He executed them with precision." He used his medical expertise to kill and to avoid detection. This was not impaired judgment. This was calculated predation. The testimony consumed weeks. Each day brought new revelations, new details that painted an increasingly disturbing portrait of systematic murder disguised as medical care. Journalists filled courtroom benches, broadcasting updates to a horrified nation. Venezuela grappled with the knowledge that one of its physicians had betrayed everything medicine represented. Finally, the testimony concluded. The defense and prosecution presented closing arguments. Then the judge retired to deliberate on appropriate sentencing. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Victims' families held hands, prayed, hoped for justice that could never truly repair what had been stolen from them. Prada sat between his attorneys, face blank, seemingly unconcerned about his fate. When the judge returned, the courtroom rose. What followed would determine how Venezuela responded to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in its history, how the legal system would address a physician who had transformed healing into mass murder, how justice would be served for victims whose only crime had been trusting a doctor who wore death like a second skin. The judge began reading the sentence. And with each word, the full weight of Prada's crimes translated into legal consequence, into years and conditions and restrictions designed to ensure he would never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. The angel of death would finally face his reckoning. The judge's voice carried through the silent courtroom with measured gravity. Hernando Arturo Prada was sentenced to 30 years of imprisonment for each confirmed murder, a total of over 700 years behind bars. Under Venezuelan law, sentences would run concurrently, meaning he would serve a maximum of 30 years, but with no possibility of parole, no opportunity for reduced sentencing, no chance of ever walking free. The courtroom erupted. Some families wept with relief. Others shouted that the sentence wasn't enough, that 30 years couldn't possibly balance against dozens of lives stolen, families destroyed, trust shattered. Security officers moved to maintain order as emotions overflowed boundaries that legal proceedings normally contain. Prada showed no reaction. As the judge detailed the terms of his imprisonment, isolation from general population, restrictions on communication, regular psychiatric monitoring, he sat motionless, his face a mask of indifference. When officers approached to escort him from the courtroom for the final time, he stood without resistance, allowing himself to be led away without looking back at the families whose lives he had devastated. The media coverage that followed was intense and sustained. Newspapers ran retrospective analyses of the case, examining how a physician could commit such crimes for so long without detection. Television programs featured interviews with survivors, family members, and investigators. The story dominated national conversation, forcing uncomfortable questions about hospital safety, medical oversight, and the systems meant to protect vulnerable patients. Hospital administrators faced harsh criticism. How had Prada operated freely for so long? Why had the mortality rate increases not triggered earlier investigation? What oversight failures had allowed a predator to hunt within medical facilities? Several senior officials resigned under pressure. The hospital where most murders occurred faced multiple lawsuits from victims' families. The nursing staff, particularly those who had worked directly with Prada, struggled with profound guilt and betrayal. Some had considered him a colleague, even a friend. They had shared meals with him, discussed cases, trusted his clinical judgment. Now they had to reconcile that memory with the truth of what he had been doing. Several nurses required psychological counseling to process the trauma of unwittingly working alongside a serial killer. The nurse who had first documented the suspicious patterns became something of a reluctant hero. Media outlets wanted interviews. She declined most, uncomfortable with attention, still processing her own complicated feelings. She had helped stop Prada, had potentially saved lives by coming forward, but she also wrestled with questions about whether she should have acted sooner, whether her initial hesitation had cost additional lives. Venezuela's medical community underwent intense soul-searching. Medical schools revised their psychological screening protocols for applicants, attempting to identify individuals who might pose future dangers. Hospitals implemented new monitoring systems, cross-checking patient outcomes against staff schedules, creating oversight mechanisms designed to detect suspicious patterns more quickly. A national registry was established tracking medical professionals who faced disciplinary action, creating a system to prevent problematic individuals from simply moving between institutions. It was a response to horror, an attempt to ensure that no one like Prada could operate with such freedom again. But the deepest impacts were felt by the victims' families, whose grief was complicated by betrayal, whose mourning was tainted by the knowledge that their loved ones had been murdered by someone sworn to protect them. Maria Rodriguez had lost her husband, the 42-year-old accountant who had entered the hospital for routine treatment and never returned home. In the 2 years since his death, she had tried to move forward, to be strong for their 3 children, to build a life from the ruins of sudden loss. Then came the knock on her door, the police officers who informed her that her husband hadn't died from natural causes, that he had been murdered. The revelation shattered her again, reopening wounds that had barely begun healing. She had trusted the hospital, believed the doctors who explained that sometimes complications arise, that medicine cannot always save everyone. Learning that her husband's death had been deliberate, that he had died because a physician chose to kill him, transformed her grief into something more complex and corrosive. She attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, forcing Prada to see her face, to be reminded that his victims were real people with families who loved them. When the sentence was pronounced, she felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. Her husband was still gone. Her children still grew up without a father. Justice, such as it was, changed nothing about the fundamental loss. Carlos Martinez, whose elderly mother had been murdered while recovering from hip surgery, channeled his grief into activism. He founded a victims' advocacy group, connecting families who had lost loved ones to medical violence, pushing for stronger oversight and accountability measures. He testified before legislative committees, his mother's photograph displayed beside him, a reminder that statistics represented human lives. My mother survived poverty, raised 6 children alone, lived through dictatorship and political upheaval, he told lawmakers. She survived everything life threw at her, but she couldn't survive a doctor who decided she should die. We have to do better. We have to protect people when they're most vulnerable. The psychological toll on surviving victims was equally devastating. The 36-year-old father, who had nearly died after Prada injected poison into his 4, developed severe anxiety around medical settings. Even routine doctor visits triggered panic attacks. He couldn't enter a hospital without experiencing overwhelming fear, his body remembering what his mind tried to forget, the sensation of poison flooding his system, the terror of dying while the person causing it wore a white coat and a calm expression. Therapy helped, but some scars ran too deep for complete healing. He lived with hypervigilance, with the knowledge that trust could be fatal, that the face of evil sometimes looked ordinary and professional. His children asked why Daddy got nervous at the doctor's office. How did he explain that sometimes the people meant to help you want to hurt you instead? Inside the maximum security prison where Prada was housed, he became a figure of particular infamy. Even among violent criminals, there exists a hierarchy of contempt, and those who harm children, elderly people, or vulnerable individuals occupy the lowest rungs. Serial killers who targeted hospital patients were viewed with special revulsion. Prison officials kept Prada in administrative segregation for his own protection. He spent 23 hours per day in a small cell, allowed 1 hour for exercise in a solitary yard, permitted minimal contact with other inmates. It was a life of extreme isolation, of crushing monotony, of years stretching toward an inevitable end within concrete walls. Psychiatric evaluations continued throughout his imprisonment. Psychologists studied him, trying to understand the internal landscape that had produced such systematic violence. Prada participated in these sessions with clinical detachment, discussing his crimes as if analyzing someone else's behavior. During one session, 5 years into his sentence, the psychiatrist asked if he felt remorse. Prada considered the question carefully before responding. "I understand that what I did was wrong according to society's rules," he said. "I understand that people were harmed. But do I feel remorse? I'm not sure I'm capable of feeling that." The psychiatrist noted that this was perhaps the most honest thing Prada had ever said. He recognized intellectually that his actions had been harmful, but he couldn't access the emotional dimension that transforms intellectual understanding into genuine regret. The machinery of conscience that makes most people feel guilt, shame, and empathy for those they've harmed simply didn't function in him. This emotional void became the focus of extensive study. Researchers examined Prada's case alongside other medical serial killers, Harold Shipman in England, who killed at least 215 patients, Kristen Gilbert in America, who murdered 4 patients and attempted to kill 3 others, Janine Jones, who killed up to 60 infants and children. These cases revealed disturbing commonalities. Medical serial killers often operated for extended periods before detection. Their positions provided access to vulnerable victims and credible cover stories for deaths. They frequently exhibited narcissistic personality traits, enjoyed the power of life and death, and showed minimal genuine remorse. They were difficult to catch because death in medical settings, while tragic, is expected and often attributed to natural causes without thorough investigation. The research sparked important conversations about how to prevent such individuals from entering medical professions. Psychological screening could identify some risk factors, but determined individuals could manipulate assessments. Some experts argued for more robust monitoring systems, algorithms that would flag unusual mortality patterns automatically, creating tripwires that would trigger investigation before body counts reached Prada-level numbers. But prevention remained challenging. Medicine requires people willing to confront death regularly, to make difficult decisions, to maintain emotional distance from suffering. These same qualities, when combined with certain personality pathologies, could create monsters. The line between necessary clinical detachment and dangerous emotional void was sometimes terrifyingly thin. 10 years into Prada's sentence, a journalist requested an interview. Prison officials debated before granting permission, ultimately deciding that allowing Prada to speak might serve public education purposes. The interview was conducted in a secure room, cameras recording, guards stationed nearby. The journalist asked Prada about his first murder, whether he remembered the moment he decided to kill. Prada's response was chilling in its simplicity. "There wasn't really a decision," he said. "It was more like recognizing something that had always been there. I looked at a patient, and I understood that I could end their life if I chose to. And once I understood that, once I recognized that power, not acting on it would have felt like denying my nature." He spoke about his crimes with the same analytical tone he might use to discuss weather patterns or traffic flow. The journalist pressed him about the suffering he had caused, about families destroyed, about lives stolen. Prada acknowledged these facts but showed no emotional engagement with them. They were abstract consequences, intellectual concepts that failed to penetrate whatever shield separated him from normal human feeling. When asked if he would kill again if given the opportunity, Prada paused before answering. "I don't know," he finally said. "I'd like to say no, that I've changed, that imprisonment has reformed me. But I'm not sure that's true. I think if I found myself in the same circumstances with the same access and opportunity, I might make the same choices. There's something broken in me. I recognize it intellectually, but I can't feel its wrongness the way you probably expect I should." The interview aired as part of a documentary about hospital serial killers. It generated enormous controversy. Some argued that giving Prada a platform was obscene, that his voice didn't deserve amplification. Others contended that understanding such individuals was essential to preventing future tragedies, that studying monsters was distasteful but necessary work. Victims' families were divided. Some refused to watch, wanting no further engagement with the man who had devastated their lives. Others watched, hoping for explanation, for some insight that might help them understand the incomprehensible. Most found neither comfort nor understanding, only confirmation that Prada remained emotionally empty, fundamentally disconnected from the humanity he had violated so profoundly. As years accumulated, the media attention gradually faded. New cases, new tragedies, new horrors captured public attention. Prada became a historical footnote, occasionally referenced in discussions of medical ethics or serial killer psychology, but no longer dominating headlines. The acute phase of national shock gave way to chronic awareness, a scar in Venezuela's collective memory rather than an open wound. But for those directly affected, Time brought no such distance. Maria Rodriguez, the widow whose husband had been murdered, continued living with the absence. Her children grew up, graduated, started careers, but always with a father-shaped hole in their lives. She remarried eventually, finding companionship and support, but the betrayal of her first husband's death remained a permanent part of her story. Carlos Martinez, the activist who had lost his mother, continued his advocacy work. He collaborated with legislators to strengthen hospital oversight, testified at trials of other medical professionals accused of harming patients, and spoke at medical schools about the sacred trust between physicians and patients. His mother's death had destroyed him temporarily, but he had rebuilt himself around purpose, transforming grief into action. The nurse who had first documented the suspicious patterns changed careers. She could no longer work in clinical settings without being haunted by what she had witnessed, by the murders that had occurred while she worked alongside the killer. She moved into medical education, teaching future nurses about professional ethics, about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, about the courage required to question authority when lives are at stake. 20 years into his sentence, Prada developed heart disease. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had deliberately stopped so many hearts now faced his own failing. He received treatment in the prison medical facility, where staff members cared for him with professional detachment, performing their duties despite knowing what he had done. It was a testament to their commitment to medical ethics, treating even monsters because their oath demanded it. Prada survived the cardiac event, returning to his cell to continue serving his sentence. But his health deteriorated progressively. The man who had once walked hospital corridors with predatory confidence was now elderly, diminished, his body betraying him the way he had betrayed his patients. In his final years, he agreed to participate in additional psychological studies. Researchers hoped that proximity to death might crack his emotional armor, might produce genuine remorse or revelation. Didn't. Even facing mortality, Prada remained intellectually aware of his crimes but emotionally disconnected from their impact. He was a case study in the mystery of human conscience. What happens when that essential element of humanity simply doesn't exist? He died in prison at age 73, 28 years into his sentence, 2 years short of his maximum term. The cause was multiple organ failure, his body finally surrendering to accumulated medical conditions. There was no funeral, no public service. He was cremated, his ashes disposed of without ceremony. His death marked only in prison records and a brief news mention. The notice of his death triggered complicated responses. Some victims' families felt relief. The monster was finally gone, incapable of causing further harm. Others felt cheated. He had died of natural causes, experiencing none of the terror he had inflicted on his victims. A few felt nothing at all, having processed their grief years earlier, having moved forward despite the wounds he had caused. Venezuela's medical community used his death as an opportunity for reflection. Medical schools held ethics symposiums, examining the case, discussing how to identify and prevent future Pradas. Hospital administrators reviewed their safety protocols, ensuring that the monitoring systems implemented after his arrest remained functional and effective. But perhaps the most profound legacy was the permanent loss of innocence. Before Prada, Venezuelan society maintained a fundamental trust in medical professionals. After him, that trust had to be rebuilt more carefully, more skeptically. Parents questioned doctors more assertively. Patients requested explanations for treatments. Families stayed vigilant during hospital visits, no longer assuming that white coats automatically signified benevolence. The angel of death had left scars that extended far beyond his direct victims. He had damaged the sacred covenant between healer and patient, had demonstrated that trust could be weaponized, that the most dangerous predators sometimes wear the most respectable disguises. Decades after his crimes, the case remained a touchstone in discussions of medical ethics, criminal psychology, and institutional accountability. Books analyzed his methods. Documentaries explored his psychology. University courses examined the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate for so long. His name became synonymous with medical betrayal, a cautionary tale whispered in hospital corridors, a reminder that vigilance must never waver when vulnerable lives depend on professional integrity. The families who lost loved ones to Hernando Prada continued living, carrying their grief, finding what peace they could. Some days were easier than others. Some anniversaries hurt less with passing time. But the fundamental truth never changed. People they loved had been murdered by someone sworn to protect them. That violation, that betrayal, that loss would echo through generations. And somewhere in the archives of Venezuela's judicial system, in boxes of evidence and transcripts and photographs, the full record of Prada's crimes remained. A catalog of horror, a testament to the depths of human depravity, and a permanent warning that monsters sometimes hide behind the most trusted faces. The angel of death was gone, but the shadows he cast would linger forever, a darkness that no amount of time could fully dispel, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it walks quietly through hospital corridors, wearing a white coat and a gentle smile, carrying death in healing hands. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4: The Monster of Tenerife. Some predators wear uniforms and badges, walking freely among us until the day their basement speaks louder than their lies. He didn't just destroy lives. He collected them, piece by piece, in a house where screams became wallpaper and death was the only tenant who never left. We hunt monsters every day on this channel, but what happens when the monster isn't hiding in shadows? When he's your neighbor, your taxi driver, the man who waves at your children? Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre didn't lurk in darkness. He thrived in plain sight, a walking nightmare dressed in human skin, turning the sunny paradise of Tenerife into his personal hunting ground. They called him the Monster of Tenerife, but that name doesn't capture the calculated evil, the methodical destruction, the cold precision of a man who treated human beings like experiments in a laboratory of suffering. This isn't just a story about murder. This is about a predator so patient, so meticulous, that by the time the world discovered what he'd done, the bodies had already begun to whisper from their graves. Tenerife, the largest of Spain's Canary Islands, sparkles like a jewel in the Atlantic Ocean. Tourists flock to its volcanic beaches, its eternal sunshine, its promise of escape from the mundane horrors of everyday life. But in 1998, while vacationers sipped sangria and danced under Mediterranean stars, something rancid festered in the heart of this paradise. A rot so deep, so pervasive, that when it finally surfaced, the entire island would recoil in collective horror. Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre was 51 years old when police finally knocked on his door, but his monstrosity had been decades in the making. Standing at average height with thinning hair and unremarkable features, he possessed the kind of face that disappears in crowds, the kind of presence that slides past security cameras and slips through memory like water through fingers. He worked odd jobs, taxi driver, street vendor, handyman, the sort of employment that granted him access to countless strangers without raising suspicion. People trusted him because he looked trustworthy, because monsters in our imagination wear horns and carry pitchforks, not driver's licenses and friendly smiles. But Luis was patient. Patience, after all, is the predator's greatest weapon. His hunting grounds weren't dark alleys or abandoned warehouses. No, Luis understood that the most effective camouflage is normalcy, that the best place to hide atrocity is within the mundane rhythm of daily life. He lived in La Laguna, a UNESCO World Heritage City known for its colonial architecture and university students, where old churches cast long shadows over cobblestone streets and history breathed from every corner. His home, a modest, nondescript building that neighbors would later describe as quiet and ordinary, became the epicenter of unspeakable evil. The first disappearances didn't trigger alarm bells. They should have, but they didn't. This is how monsters thrive. By selecting victims society has already abandoned, people whose absence creates ripples so small that the world barely notices the disturbance. Luis targeted the vulnerable with surgical precision. Drug addicts, prostitutes, homeless individuals, immigrants without documentation. These were people existing on society's periphery, humans whose lives had been devalued long before Luis decided to extinguish them entirely. Maria was one of his first known victims, though her real name has been lost to time and bureaucratic indifference. She worked the streets of Santa Cruz, selling her body to feed a heroin addiction that had consumed her since adolescence. Friends, if you could call them that, remembered her as quiet, damaged, a ghost haunting her own life. One evening in 1995, she climbed into Luis's taxi for what she thought would be a quick transaction. She was never seen alive again. But Maria wasn't just murdered. She was erased. Luis didn't simply kill his victims. He obliterated their existence with the thoroughness of someone who had planned every detail, who had fantasized about this moment until fantasy became necessity. His house contained a workshop of horrors, a carefully curated collection of tools designed not for construction but for destruction. Saws, knives, chemicals, plastic sheeting, rope, chains, each item served a specific purpose in his ritual of annihilation. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Luis would identify a target, someone whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation, someone whose absence would be attributed to the chaotic nature of their lifestyle rather than foul play. He would approach them with offers of money, drugs, shelter, whatever bait would lure them into his vehicle. Once inside, once the door closed and the locks clicked, their fate was sealed. His home became a slaughterhouse. Neighbors would later report strange smells, sweet and rotten simultaneously, that they attributed to garbage or plumbing problems. Some heard sounds, thuds, scraping, muffled noises that could have been furniture being moved or arguments through thin walls. One neighbor recalled seeing Luis burning items in his backyard late at night, flames dancing in the darkness as acrid smoke billowed toward the stars. But nobody connected these disparate pieces into the grotesque puzzle they formed. Luis's method involved not just killing but dismemberment, a process he approached with disturbing efficiency. He would keep bodies in his home for days, sometimes weeks, working on them methodically, reducing human beings to manageable pieces that could be disposed of without detection. Some remains he buried in his garden, planting flowers over graves as if death could bloom into beauty. Others he burned, watching flesh and bone transform into ash and smoke. Some body parts he simply threw away with regular trash, understanding that sanitation workers don't inspect every bag, that the system's efficiency depends on not looking too closely at what we discard. The psychology of Luis Ramirez Maestre defies simple categorization. He wasn't driven by sexual sadism in the traditional sense, though power and control clearly motivated him. He didn't keep trophies or revisit dump sites. His murders weren't crimes of passion or rage. Instead, they possessed an almost industrial quality, as if he viewed killing as a process to be refined, perfected, made efficient. Victims later discovered in his home showed signs of prolonged captivity, suggesting he didn't kill immediately but instead kept people alive, extending their suffering for reasons only he understood. Former acquaintances would describe Luis as quiet but not withdrawn, polite but not warm. He maintained superficial relationships, appearing at social gatherings just frequently enough to avoid suspicion, contributing just enough to conversations to seem normal. He had been married once, briefly, though his ex-wife would later tell investigators she always sensed something wrong, something off about the man she shared a bed with. She described waking at night to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. Not desire, not affection, but something analytical, as if he were studying a specimen rather than looking at his wife. The island's police force, understaffed and overwhelmed with tourist-related crimes, failed to notice the pattern. Individual missing persons reports gathered dust in file cabinets, each case treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger, terrifying whole. Drug addicts overdose. Prostitutes move to different cities. Homeless people simply vanish. These explanations satisfied authorities because believing them was easier than confronting the alternative, that someone was systematically hunting and destroying human beings in their quiet, sunny paradise. By 1998, Luis had perfected his craft. He had killed at least 9 people, though investigators suspected the true number might be higher, possibly much higher. Bodies decompose, evidence disappears, and without bodies, there are no murder investigations. He had learned from early mistakes, refined his techniques, grown bolder. The gap between kills shortened. The risks he took increased. This escalation is typical of serial offenders, a psychological progression driven by diminishing returns. Each murder satisfies less, requires more, pushes the predator toward inevitable exposure. But Luis made a mistake. All monsters eventually do. In July 1998, he approached a young woman named Remedios Soriano. Unlike his previous victims, Remedios was employed, had family who cared about her, lived a relatively stable life. But she was also hitchhiking home late at night, making herself vulnerable in that momentary lapse of judgment we all commit, that tiny window where tragedy can slip through. Luis offered her a ride. She accepted. Remedios' family reported her missing immediately. They filed reports, distributed flyers, called the police daily. They refused to let their daughter become another forgotten statistic. Their persistence caught the attention of a detective named Juan Carlos, a 20-year veteran who had grown cynical about the department's casual approach to certain disappearances. He began pulling files, cross-referencing dates and locations, looking for patterns everyone else had missed. What he found made his blood freeze. Over the previous 3 years, at least 8 people had disappeared from similar areas at similar times under similar circumstances. All were vulnerable. All vanished completely. And several witnesses, when pressed, recalled seeing victims with a middle-aged man driving a taxi, a man whose description, though vague, kept repeating. Average height, thinning hair, unremarkable face. A man named Luis Ramirez Maestre. When police secured a warrant to search Luis Ramirez Maestre's home on August 31, 1998, they expected to find evidence. Perhaps some personal items belonging to Remedios Soriano, maybe traces of blood, clues that would connect Luis to her disappearance. What they discovered instead was a landscape of human suffering so profound, so meticulously constructed, that hardened officers would later require psychological counseling, that crime scene investigators would wake screaming from nightmares years afterward. The house stood innocuously among its neighbors, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and shuttered windows. Nothing about its exterior suggested the cathedral of death existing within its walls. But the moment officers breached the front door, the smell hit them. A wall of putrefaction so thick, so visceral, that several officers immediately vomited on the front steps. This wasn't the smell of garbage or neglect. This was the unmistakable stench of decomposing human flesh, of death allowed to fester and rot in enclosed spaces. The living room appeared almost normal at first glance. Worn furniture, a television, scattered newspapers. But investigators noticed the windows had been covered with thick black plastic, sealed with tape to prevent light penetration or odor escape. The carpet bore dark stains that luminol would later reveal to be massive blood spatters, evidence of violence so extreme it had saturated through to the floorboards beneath. Drag marks scored the floor, leading from the entrance toward the back of the house, paths traced by bodies too heavy or too unwilling to walk under their own power. The kitchen had been converted into something resembling a butcher's workshop. Industrial-sized plastic sheeting covered every surface. The sink contained traces of blood and tissue. Knives of various sizes hung from magnetic strips on the wall, their blades worn from repeated use and sharpening. But most disturbing was the large freezer unit standing against one wall, humming with electrical life, maintaining its cold preservation of contents no freezer should ever hold. Officers approached the freezer with weapons drawn, though what threat could remain in this charnel house remained unclear. When they finally opened it, the sight inside would become legend in Spanish law enforcement circles, a cautionary tale shared in training academies, an example of the depths of human depravity. Inside, carefully wrapped in plastic and labeled with dates, were human body parts. Arms, legs, a torso, sections of flesh removed with surgical precision. Luis had been storing his victims like groceries, preserving them for reasons investigators could only speculate about with mounting horror. The basement exceeded even the kitchen's grotesque revelations. Descending the narrow stairs into that underground chamber, officers entered what one would later describe as crossing the threshold into hell itself. The space had been soundproofed with foam panels and heavy blankets nailed to walls, creating an acoustic tomb where screams would die without reaching the world above. Chains bolted to support beams hung empty now, but the dried blood coating their links testified to their terrible purpose. A medical examination table occupied the room's center, its metal surface scratched and dented, its edges encrusted with biological matter that would later be identified as belonging to multiple victims. Along one wall stood shelving units containing what could only be described as a trophy collection, though Luis's trophies weren't traditional serial killer keepsakes. Instead of jewelry or photographs, he had collected identification documents, passports, identity cards, driver's licenses, each representing a life extinguished, an identity erased. Dozens of faces stared out from these documents, frozen in bureaucratic photographs. People who had smiled or frowned at camera flashes without knowing these images would become their final portraits. Most disturbing was the documentation Luis had kept. Multiple notebooks filled with handwritten entries chronicled his crimes with the detachment of a scientist conducting experiments. He described his victims not by name but by number and physical characteristics. He documented their reactions to captivity, to pain, to the realization of their impending death. He noted which methods of killing were most efficient, which disposal techniques worked best, which locations provided the safest dumping grounds. Reading these entries, investigators realized they weren't dealing with a crime of passion or even traditional serial murder. This was systematic, organized, a man who approached killing with the same methodology someone else might apply to carpentry or accounting. One entry, dated 3 months prior, described Remedios Soriano in chilling detail. Luis had followed her for weeks before making his move, learning her routines, identifying her vulnerabilities, planning the optimal moment for abduction. He wrote about the thrill of acquisition, the satisfaction of successfully adding another specimen to his collection. But the entry ended abruptly, suggesting he had been interrupted or had decided to wait before completing his usual process. This interruption likely saved Remedios' life. Further search of the property revealed a small storage room behind a false wall in the basement, a space barely large enough for a person to lie down. Inside, investigators found Remedios Soriano, barely alive, dehydrated, traumatized beyond measure, but breathing. She had been captive for nearly 8 weeks, existing in total darkness, fed sporadically, subjected to horrors she would never fully articulate even years later in therapy sessions. Her rescue became the one redemptive moment in an otherwise pitch-black case. Paramedics rushed her to hospital where doctors would spend weeks treating physical wounds while acknowledging the psychological damage might never fully heal. But she was alive, snatched from death's embrace by the persistence of her family and the dedication of detectives who refused to let another person disappear into Luis's void. The garden behind Luis's house yielded additional horrors. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple areas of disturbed soil, each marking a grave. Forensic teams spent weeks excavating the small property, uncovering remains buried at various depths, in various states of decomposition. Some bodies had been dismembered before burial. Others appeared to have been buried whole, though autopsy would reveal these victims had been killed elsewhere and transported. The garden, which neighbors remembered as surprisingly lush with flowering plants, had been fertilized with human remains, a grotesque perversion of the cycle of life and death. Dental records and DNA analysis would eventually identify 9 victims, 6 women and 3 men, ranging in age from 19 to 47. Each had been reported missing. Each report had been filed, logged, and essentially ignored because their lives, marked by addiction, poverty, or circumstance, had been deemed less worthy of investigation. This systemic failure, this societal indifference to certain lives, had provided Luis with the cover he needed to continue killing for years. The victims' families, many of whom had spent years searching, oscillated between grief and rage. They had known something was wrong, had begged authorities to investigate more thoroughly, had been dismissed or patronized. Now, confronting the reality of how their loved ones had died, they demanded accountability not just from Luis but from the system that had failed so catastrophically. Forensic psychologists called to analyze Luis's notebooks, and the crime scene structure developed a profile of a man driven by a need for absolute control. Someone who found satisfaction not in the killing itself, but in the process of domination, degradation, and disposal. Unlike many serial killers who seek media attention or want their crimes recognized, Luis had worked to remain invisible, understanding that anonymity ensured longevity. His careful victim selection, his methodical disposal methods, his documentation, all pointed to someone who intended to continue indefinitely, who viewed killing not as an aberration but as a permanent aspect of his existence. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Police found Luis at a local bar, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper, as if he were just another citizen enjoying a late afternoon. When officers approached, he didn't run or resist. He simply looked up, registered their presence with emotionless eyes, and said, "I've been expecting you." No panic, no denial, just cold acceptance that his campaign had finally ended. During the drive to the police station, Luis remained silent, staring out the window at the island that had been his hunting ground. Neighbors emerged from their homes, watching the police vehicles pass, confusion on their faces. That man, the quiet one who sometimes helped with groceries? Impossible. But the impossible had been living next door, parking in their shared lot, existing in the spaces between their lives while conducting an orchestra of death. The interrogation room became Luis's confessional, though he showed no signs of remorse or religious fervor. Instead, he spoke with clinical detachment about his crimes, answering questions with the bored efficiency of someone filling out a form. Yes, he had killed 9 people, possibly more. He couldn't remember exact numbers. Yes, he had kept some alive for extended periods. Why? Because he could, because it interested him, because watching someone transition from hope to despair to acceptance provided him with a satisfaction nothing else could match. Detectives asked about empathy, about whether he understood the suffering he'd caused. Luis considered the question with apparent seriousness before responding that empathy was a weakness, a limitation that prevented people from pursuing their authentic desires. He felt no connection to his victims' pain because their pain served a purpose, his purpose. They existed to fulfill his needs, and once they had served that function, their continued existence became irrelevant. This chilling philosophy revealed a man completely disconnected from normal human emotional architecture. Psychologists would later debate diagnoses: psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, sadistic personality disorder, but labels seemed inadequate when confronting the reality of Luis Ramirez Maestre. He existed outside conventional categories, a human predator who had evolved beyond empathy into something functionally monstrous. Evidence collected from his home would fill entire warehouses, thousands of photographs, hundreds of pages of documentation, physical evidence linking him conclusively to 9 murders and suggesting involvement in possibly dozens more. The scope of his crimes continued expanding as investigators connected cold cases across Spain and the Canary Islands to patterns matching Luis's methodology. The trial of Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre began on March 15, 1999, in a heavily secured courtroom in Santa Cruz de Tenerife. Security had been tripled after death threats flooded the prosecutor's office. Not threats against Luis, but threats from citizens warning that if the justice system failed, they would take matters into their own hands. The island, indeed all of Spain, watched with collective breath held, demanding justice, demanding answers to questions that might have no satisfying resolution. Luis entered the courtroom in shackles, flanked by armed guards, and the gallery erupted. Family members of victims screamed accusations, curses, prayers for his eternal damnation. Some sobbed uncontrollably, confronting for the first time in person the man who had destroyed their worlds. Luis remained impassive, his face a mask of indifference, occasionally scanning the crowd with the detached curiosity of someone observing an interesting experiment. The prosecution, led by Carmen Vasquez, a veteran attorney known for her methodical approach and emotional control, opened with a statement that stripped away any pretense of civilized legal proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she carried. "Over the next weeks, we will present evidence of crimes so heinous, so calculated, so devoid of human compassion that you will question whether the defendant before you can truly be classified as human. Luis Ramirez Maestre is not a man who killed in passion or rage. He is not someone who made a terrible mistake. He is a predator who systematically hunted, tortured, and destroyed human beings for his own satisfaction over a period of years. The defense attorney, Miguel Ángel Ruiz, faced an impossible task. Appointed by the court after no private attorney would take the case, he understood his role wasn't to prove innocence. The evidence made that laughable, but to ensure due process, to guarantee that even monsters receive fair trials because that's what separates civilization from barbarism. His opening statement was brief, acknowledging the crimes but suggesting that Luis's mental state should be considered, that perhaps he was sick rather than evil, deserving of medical intervention rather than purely punitive response. This argument ignited fierce debate inside and outside the courtroom. Was Luis insane? Psychologists testified from both sides. The prosecution's experts argued that while Luis displayed clear psychopathic traits, he understood right from wrong, could control his actions, and meticulously planned his crimes, all indicators of sanity within legal definitions. His notebooks demonstrated rational thought, cause and effect reasoning, adaptation when circumstances changed. An insane person couldn't maintain the level of organization Luis displayed. The defense's psychological experts countered that anyone capable of such sustained cruelty must, by definition, be mentally ill. They pointed to brain imaging studies showing abnormalities in Luis's frontal lobe, areas associated with empathy and impulse control. They presented his childhood history, neglect, possible abuse, developmental markers suggesting early disconnection from normal emotional bonds. They argued for diminished capacity, for recognition that something fundamentally broken in Luis's neurology predisposed him toward violence. But as testimony continued, as evidence mounted, the insanity defense crumbled under the weight of Luis's own documentation. Prosecutors presented his notebooks, having witnesses read passages aloud. The courtroom fell silent as Luis's own words revealed not a confused or delusional mind, but a calculating intelligence fully aware of his actions and their consequences. One entry particularly devastated the defense. I understand society considers these actions wrong. I understand there are potential consequences if discovered. But understanding social constructs and agreeing with them are different matters. I choose to prioritize my interests over societal rules because those rules serve the majority, not exceptional individuals like myself. This wasn't madness. This was conscious choice, explicit rejection of moral constraints with full awareness of their existence. Luis believed himself above such concerns, entitled to take what he wanted because he possessed the capability to do so. The psychology experts characterized this as extreme narcissism combined with psychopathy, terrible personality disorders, certainly, but not legal insanity. Victim testimony provided the trial's most emotionally devastating moments. Remedios Soriano, still visibly traumatized, took the stand to describe her captivity. She spoke in a barely audible voice about the darkness, the hunger, the sounds from other rooms that suggested she wasn't alone. The moment she realized her captor intended to keep her indefinitely. Defense attorneys tried to limit her testimony, arguing it was prejudicial, but the judge overruled them. The jury, the public, deserved to understand the human cost of Luis's calculated evil. Family members testified about their loved ones, not as statistics or police reports, but as people. Maria's sister described a woman who had struggled with addiction but was working toward recovery, who had dreams of becoming clean, of rebuilding her life. Another victim's mother clutched a photograph while describing her son's kindness, his laughter, the hole his disappearance had torn through their family. Each testimony transformed abstract body counts into painful human realities. The prosecution methodically presented physical evidence, photographs of the house's interior, the basement, the garden graves. They showed the jury items recovered from Luis's home, the chains, the tools, the freezer's contents. Several jury members wept openly. 2 requested removal from the case, claiming they couldn't maintain objectivity after seeing such evidence. The judge denied their requests, reminding them that bearing witness to difficult truths is sometimes a citizen's duty. Luis himself finally testified, against his attorney's advice. He took the stand with the same emotional flatness he'd displayed throughout the trial, answering questions with technical precision but no emotional resonance. When asked if he felt remorse, he paused, considering the question with apparent seriousness. "Remorse implies I believe I did something wrong," he finally answered. "I don't share that belief. I acted according to my nature, pursuing what interested me. Should the lion feel remorse for the gazelle?" This comparison, positioning himself as a natural predator, his victims as mere prey, created audible gasps throughout the courtroom. Prosecutors couldn't have scripted a more damning self-characterization. Defense attorneys visibly winced, knowing their client had just demolished any remaining sympathy. The prosecution asked about specific victims, trying to force Luis to confront their humanity. They showed photographs of people while alive, smiling, living. They asked him to speak their names, to acknowledge them as people rather than objects. Luis complied mechanically, reading names from photographs like someone identifying items on a list, displaying no recognition that these images represented destroyed lives, grieving families, severed futures. "Did Maria Herrera beg for her life?" the prosecutor asked, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Yes," Luis replied simply. "Did you consider her plea?" "No." "Why not?" "Because her desire to live was less important than my desire to continue my work." This exchange, broadcast across Spain, crystallized public perception. Luis wasn't pleading temporary insanity or diminished capacity with any conviction. He was simply stating his worldview, one where other people existed as resources to be used rather than individuals deserving consideration. Expert testimony addressed the question that haunted everyone. Could someone like Luis be rehabilitated? Could therapy, medication, intervention of any kind transform him into someone safe to exist in society? The consensus was chilling, no. Luis's personality structure was so fundamentally different from neurotypical humans that rehabilitation presupposed capacities he simply didn't possess. You can't teach empathy to someone whose brain lacks the neural architecture to experience it. You can't instill remorse in someone who views morality as a social convention rather than an internal imperative. This testimony effectively eliminated life imprisonment with possibility of parole as a reasonable option. If Luis could never be safely released, what purpose did anything less than permanent incarceration serve? The prosecution's closing argument synthesized weeks of testimony into a coherent narrative of calculated evil. Carmen Vasquez stood before the jury, her exhaustion visible after weeks of immersion in horrors that would mark her permanently. Luis Ramirez Maestre represents every parent's nightmare, every vulnerable person's predator, every community's hidden monster. But more importantly, he represents our failure to protect the most vulnerable among us. 9 people died terrible deaths because they lived on society's margins, because their disappearances didn't trigger immediate action, because we collectively decided some lives matter less than others. She paused, looking directly at Luis, who met her gaze with empty eyes. The defense will ask you to consider mitigating factors, to view the defendant as sick rather than evil. But sickness implies something happened to him, that external forces created this monster. The evidence shows otherwise. Luis Ramirez Maestre made choices, deliberate and conscious choices, to hunt, torture, and kill. He chose victims he knew would be overlooked. He chose methods he knew would be effective. He documented his crimes not because he was compelled by illness, but because he found them interesting, worth recording, worth perfecting. The defense's closing argument felt perfunctory, a legal obligation performed without conviction. Miguel Angel Ruiz acknowledged his client's crimes but urged the jury to consider the possibility, however remote, that something beyond conscious choice drove Luis's actions. He invoked the principle that society should be judged by how it treats its worst members, that giving in to vengeance rather than justice diminishes everyone. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The testimony of survivors and families, the defendant's own chilling statements. The jury received instructions from the judge and retired to deliberate. They returned in less than 4 hours, remarkably quick for a case of such complexity, suggesting the verdict's clarity required little discussion. Guilty, on all 9 counts of murder, on additional charges of kidnapping, torture, and illegal disposal of human remains. The verdict arrived without surprise but with palpable relief, as if the courtroom had been holding its breath throughout the trial and could finally exhale. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Spain had abolished the death penalty decades prior, so the maximum sentence was life imprisonment. But Spanish law allowed for reviewable life sentences where prisoners could theoretically apply for parole after decades. The prosecution argued vehemently against any possibility of release. The judge, an elderly man who had presided over countless criminal cases in his career, looked physically aged by this trial as he pronounced sentence. Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre, he began, his voice heavy with the weight of judicial authority. This court sentences you to multiple life terms without possibility of parole. You will spend every remaining day of your existence in maximum security confinement. This sentence reflects not vengeance but necessity. You have demonstrated through words and actions that you pose an ongoing, unmitigatable threat to society. Luis received the sentence without visible reaction. No surprise or disappointment, just the same empty acknowledgement he'd shown throughout the proceedings. As guards escorted him from the courtroom for the final time, he glanced briefly at the gallery, his gaze sweeping across families who had lost so much to his calculated cruelty. What he saw in their faces, rage, grief, relief, appeared to register no more deeply than patterns on wallpaper. Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre disappeared into Spain's prison system, transferred to a maximum security facility designed to house the country's most dangerous offenders. His cell, measuring barely 2 by 3 meters, became his permanent home, a space far more comfortable than any he'd provided his victims. Prison officials placed him in isolation, not for his protection but for other inmates' safety. His crimes, particularly targeting the vulnerable, marked him as the lowest form of predator even among criminals. Multiple inmates had already sworn to kill him if given opportunity. The years following the trial brought multiple revelations that expanded the horror of Luis's crimes. Cold case investigators began reviewing unsolved disappearances across Spain and the Canary Islands, looking for patterns matching Luis's methodology. They found disturbing possibilities. At least 12 additional cases showed characteristics consistent with his documented murders. Bodies discovered years earlier, previously attributed to accidents or unrelated crimes, suddenly appeared potentially connected. But without concrete evidence or confession, these cases remained officially unsolved, their victims' families trapped in limbo between hope for closure and fear of terrible confirmation. Luis himself provided no assistance in these investigations. Prison psychologists who attempted to interview him found a man completely disinterested in cooperation or rehabilitation. He refused therapy, declined participation in any programs, and spent his days in isolation reading philosophy and history books. When asked about potential additional victims, he would smile slightly, not quite reaching his eyes, and respond with variations of, "I've already been convicted. Why would discussing unproven allegations benefit me?" This calculated silence represented his final act of control, hoarding information about potential victims as a last reservoir of power over authorities and grieving families. Some forensic psychologists suggested offering incentives, better prison conditions, privileges, in exchange for information. But legal ethicists and victims' advocates argued against rewarding a serial killer for information he should provide as basic human decency, acknowledging such decency wasn't in Luis's capability. The investigation into how Luis had operated undetected for so long exposed systemic failures at every level. The Tenerife Police Department underwent massive reorganization after an internal review revealed that missing persons reports involving marginalized individuals had been processed with minimal investigation. Officers were disciplined, procedures were overhauled, and a special unit was created specifically to investigate disappearances of vulnerable populations. A reform that came too late for Luis's victims but might prevent future tragedies. The media's role also faced scrutiny. While missing persons from wealthy families or photogenic young women dominated headlines, Luis's victims had barely merited paragraph mentions in local papers. This disparity in coverage reflected and reinforced societal hierarchies that valued some lives more than others. Journalists began questioning their complicity in these value judgments, asking uncomfortable questions about which stories they chose to pursue and which they allowed to languish in obscurity. Sociologists and criminologists studied the case, producing papers and books examining how monsters like Luis exploit social fault lines. His victim selection revealed intimate understanding of who society deems disposable: drug addicts, sex workers, the homeless, the undocumented. These populations exist in spaces between official oversight, where disappearances might be noticed but rarely generate sustained investigation. Luis had recognized and exploited this systemic indifference, understanding that society's margins provided him with effectively endless hunting grounds. The victims' families became advocates for reform, pushing legislation that would mandate more thorough investigation of all missing persons cases regardless of the missing individual's background. They formed support organizations, created memorials, fought to ensure their loved ones would be remembered as people rather than statistics. Maria's sister, Carmen, became particularly vocal, appearing at conferences and hearings to share her sister's story, to humanize people struggling with addiction, to demand better from systems designed to protect all citizens. Remedios Soriano's survival provided the case's only redemptive element, though redemptive hardly captures the complexity of her continued existence. She underwent years of intensive therapy, trying to process trauma that had fundamentally altered her relationship with the world. Simple activities, entering enclosed spaces, being alone, hearing certain sounds, could trigger flashbacks so intense she would dissociate, returning mentally to that storage room behind the false wall. She eventually wrote a memoir titled 8 Weeks in Hell, describing her captivity and recovery with devastating honesty. The book became a bestseller in Spain, though Remedios donated all proceeds to victims' advocacy groups, wanting no personal profit from her suffering. In her memoir, she described Luis not as the monster of public imagination, but as disturbingly ordinary in appearance and demeanor. He spoke to her sometimes during captivity, not with cruelty but with clinical interest, asking about her thoughts and feelings as if conducting an interview. This banality of evil, the disconnect between Luis's unremarkable presentation and his extraordinary crimes, haunted Remedios more than the physical suffering. How many other Luis Ramirez Maestres walked among the population, hiding monstrosity behind average faces and mundane conversations? The psychological community debated whether studying killers like Luis provided valuable insights or simply satisfied morbid curiosity. Some argued that understanding the neurology and psychology of severe psychopathy could lead to earlier identification and intervention, potentially preventing future crimes. Others countered that such research risked pathologizing and excusing behavior that should be condemned as conscious evil. The truth likely existed somewhere between these positions. Luis's brain showed measurable differences from neurotypical individuals, but these differences enabled rather than compelled his choices. Prison reports indicated Luis adjusted well to incarceration, which itself disturbed psychologists familiar with the case. Most prisoners struggle with confinement's restrictions. Luis appeared almost to prefer it. In isolation, with books and basic amenities, he expressed satisfaction with his circumstances. He had achieved a kind of stability, a routine existence without the complexities of maintaining normal social facade. In a perverse way, prison provided him exactly what he needed: structure without pretense, existence without expectation of empathy or emotional connection. Other inmates reported occasional interactions with Luis during supervised recreation periods. He would discuss philosophy or current events with analytical detachment, offering observations that demonstrated intelligence but complete emotional disconnect. One inmate, serving time for manslaughter committed during a bar fight, later told a journalist, "I killed someone in rage. In a moment I'll regret forever." Luis talks about killing like someone discussing a hobby they've grown bored with. There's nothing behind his eyes, no anger, no satisfaction, nothing. That emptiness is more frightening than any violence I've seen. The question of whether Luis represented an anomaly or a more common phenomenon than society acknowledges remained contentious. Statistics suggest that a small percentage of the population exhibits psychopathic traits, though most never commit violent crimes. They might become ruthless businesspeople, manipulative politicians, or simply difficult relatives. people who navigate life without empathy but within legal boundaries. Luis existed on the extreme end of the spectrum, where lack of empathy combined with sadistic impulses and opportunity created catastrophic results. Some researchers propose that successful psychopaths, those who never commit detectable crimes, might actually outnumber the Luis Ramirez Maestres caught by authorities. This suggestion disturbed law enforcement and the public alike, implying that monsters might be far more prevalent than comfortable to acknowledge, simply better at hiding or channeling their impulses into legal outlets. The idea that your neighbor, colleague, or friend might possess Luis's fundamental nature but better impulse control challenged basic assumptions about human society. The Tenerife community struggled with its unwanted connection to such infamy. Tourism, the island's economic lifeblood, briefly declined as news coverage associated the paradise destination with horror. Local officials worked to rehabilitate the island's image, emphasizing that one monster's crimes didn't define an entire community. But Luis's house became a macabre attraction, despite authorities' attempts to prevent dark tourism. The building was eventually demolished, the land left vacant, a scar in the neighborhood where nothing would grow or be built, as if the earth itself rejected construction on soil so thoroughly contaminated by evil. Philosophers and theologians grappled with questions Luis's existence raised. How should society understand evil in the 21st century? Was Luis a product of neurological abnormality, environmental factors, conscious choice, or some combination thereof? Religious thinkers debated whether someone lacking capacity for empathy possessed a soul in any meaningful sense, whether God could forgive someone incapable of remorse. Secular ethicists questioned whether punishment served any purpose beyond incapacitation when the punished felt no guilt or deterrent effect. These debates, while intellectually stimulating for academics, provided little comfort to those directly impacted. Family members of victims didn't care about philosophical implications. They wanted their loved ones back, wanted undoing of the irreversible, wanted Luis to suffer as their family members had suffered. But the justice system, at its best, aims higher than vengeance. It seeks to protect society while maintaining civilized principles, even when confronting individuals who reject civilization entirely. Years passed. Luis aged in his cell, his hair graying completely, his face acquiring the lines of decades spent in confinement. Prison staff reported he maintained strict routines, exercise, reading, eating with mechanical precision. He never caused disciplinary problems, never engaged in violence, never attempted escape. He existed, suspended in time, a permanent fixture in the prison's population of irredeemable men. Occasionally, journalists requested interviews. Most requests were denied by prison officials, but a few were granted under strict conditions. These interviews revealed a man unchanged by time or consequence. Luis spoke about his past crimes with the same detachment he displayed during trial, showing neither pride nor shame, just acknowledgement of events he'd participated in. When asked if he'd do anything differently, he responded, "I would have been more careful about selecting the last victim. Choosing someone with an attentive family was tactically unwise." This response, focusing on tactical error rather than moral wrongness, encapsulated Luis's complete inability to engage with conventional ethical frameworks. To him, his only mistake was getting caught, not the suffering he'd caused. Journalists emerged from these interviews feeling contaminated, as if Luis's emptiness had briefly infected them, forcing confrontation with the possibility that some humans operate according to completely alien internal logic. The case influenced popular culture, though not always responsibly. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, sometimes sensationalizing suffering for entertainment. Streaming services produced documentaries that walked fine lines between education and exploitation. Some productions maintained focus on victims and systemic failures. Others seemed more interested in Luis himself, in understanding or even glamorizing the monster. Victims' families fought against this latter tendency, arguing that Luis deserved no platform, no mystique, no transformation into anti-hero or fascinating subject. Remedios Soriano became an advocate against such sensationalism. She gave interviews condemning media that portrayed killers as interesting or complex while reducing victims to plot points. Luis wasn't fascinating, she insisted during one television appearance. He was a predator who found vulnerable prey. There's no complexity to analyze, no trauma that explains or excuses what he did. He made choices, conscious choices, and those choices destroyed lives. Stop trying to understand him and start remembering the people he erased. Her advocacy resonated with other survivors and families affected by serial killers, sparking a broader conversation about how media covers such crimes. Some outlets began implementing policies against naming killers in headlines, against using their photographs, against providing the notoriety many psychologists believe certain killers seek. Whether these policies reduce future crimes remains debated, but they at least shift focus toward victims rather than perpetrators. The psychiatric community continued studying the case, particularly regarding prediction and prevention. Could Luis have been identified as dangerous before he killed? His childhood showed warning signs: animal cruelty, social isolation, apparent lack of empathy. But millions of troubled children never become serial killers. Creating systems to intervene with at-risk youth without unjustly labeling or restricting them remained a profound challenge, one the Luis Ramirez Maestre case brought into sharp focus. Some researchers proposed that advances in neuroscience might eventually allow identification of individuals with extreme psychopathic traits before they commit crimes. Brain imaging, genetic markers, and psychological assessment could theoretically create profiles indicating elevated risk. But this possibility opened ethical cans of worms. Should society monitor or restrict people based on neurological characteristics rather than actions? Would such systems reduce crime or create minority report-style pre-crime injustices? These questions, once confined to science fiction, became increasingly relevant as technology advanced. Luis himself expressed no interest in such research. When prison psychologists asked if he'd participate in studies examining his neurology, he refused, seeing no personal benefit. This refusal typified his transactional approach to existence. Everything required cost-benefit analysis with himself as the only meaningful factor in equations. Contributing to knowledge that might prevent future crimes held no appeal because future victims' well-being didn't register as valuable. As of 2025, Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre remains imprisoned, now in his late 70s. Health reports indicate various age-related conditions: diabetes, arthritis, hypertension, though nothing immediately life-threatening. He continues his routine existence, a man suspended in time, neither rehabilitated nor particularly punished in any meaningful sense beyond physical confinement. He has spent more than half his life in prison, yet shows no indication of viewing this as particularly negative. Prison is simply where he exists now, a different location with different parameters, requiring different adaptations. The question of what happens when Luis eventually dies, whether from old age, illness, or other circumstances, has been discussed by prison officials and legal experts. Some victims' families have requested notification when his death occurs, wanting closure or at least knowledge that the threat he represented has finally ended. Others want no contact, no reminder, preferring to move forward without his continued presence in their consciousness. These differing responses reflect the personal nature of grief and trauma. There's no single correct way to process surviving encounter with monstrous evil. His body, when death finally comes, will be cremated with remains disposed of without ceremony or marker. Spain denies murderers of his caliber any honored burial, any location that could become pilgrimage site for the disturbed individuals who sometimes venerate serial killers. Luis will leave no grave, no monument, nothing physical to mark his existence except the scars, psychological and institutional, his crimes created. The victims, conversely, are memorialized. A garden in La Laguna, not far from where Luis's house once stood, was dedicated to their memory. 9 trees were planted, each bearing a plaque with the victim's name and the simple phrase, "forever remembered." The garden provides space for families to gather, for the community to acknowledge the lives lost and the systemic failures that enabled their loss. It represents hope that remembering prevents repeating, that honoring the dead motivates protecting the living. Educational programs emerged from the tragedy, teaching law enforcement, social workers, and medical professionals to recognize patterns suggesting serial predation. The Maestre Protocol, as it became known in Spain, mandates cross-referencing missing persons reports, paying particular attention to disappearances of vulnerable populations and investigating even when obvious explanations exist. While not foolproof, these procedures have reportedly helped identify potential serial offenders earlier in their criminal careers, preventing additional murders. The case also influenced international cooperation on missing persons investigations. Luis's crimes demonstrated how easily predators could operate when different jurisdictions failed to communicate. Modern databases now allow faster information sharing across regions and countries, helping investigators identify patterns that individual departments might miss. These technological advances, combined with better training and protocols, represent concrete improvements born from terrible tragedy. Yet, for all the systemic changes, all the procedures and protocols and memorials, the fundamental questions Luis's existence posed remain largely unanswered. How does society identify monsters before they kill? How do we balance civil liberties with preventive intervention? What do we owe victims of crimes that could have been prevented? How do we reconcile the apparent contradiction of conscious evil perpetrated by someone whose neurology differs fundamentally from normal humans? These questions haunt not just criminologists and philosophers, but anyone who has studied the case, anyone who has confronted the reality that people like Luis Ramirez Maestre exist, that they walk among us indistinguishable until the moment they choose to stop pretending. The monster of Tenerife isn't just one man in one place at one time. He's a reminder that darkness wears ordinary faces, that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs, that the worst predators are those who have learned to hide in plain sight. The legacy of Luis Ramirez Maestre is written in broken families, reformed systems, and the permanent awareness that paradise can contain hell, that sunny islands can hide basements of horror, that the person next to you on the bus or sitting in the cafe might be something far worse than your darkest imagination. It's uncomfortable knowledge, the kind that makes people check locks twice and eye strangers with suspicion. But perhaps that discomfort is necessary, that vigilance, personal and systemic, provides the only realistic defense against the next monster waiting to begin his collection. And somewhere in a Spanish prison, in a cell barely large enough to contain his aging body, Luis Ramirez Maestre continues existing, neither alive in any meaningful sense nor properly dead, suspended between worlds in the limbo society creates for its worst members. He reads his books, eats his meals, follows his routines, unchanged and unchangeable. A man who found what interested him and pursued it without regard for consequence until consequence finally caught him. He is not the first monster, and he will not be the last. But he is contained now, neutralized, rendered harmless through the only method proven effective: permanent separation from potential victims. It's not the justice anyone wanted, not the punishment that fits the crime, but it's the best a civilized society can offer while maintaining the principles that separate us from the Luis Ramirez Maestres who reject those principles entirely. The sun still shines on Tenerife. Tourists still visit its beaches. Life continues in the shadow of horror, as it always has, as it always must. We move forward because standing still means surrendering to the darkness, means letting monsters define our existence rather than being terrible aberrations within it. We remember the victims, implement the reforms, maintain the vigilance, and hope, perhaps naively, that the next monster will be caught before 9 becomes 10, before the basement fills with screams, before another family joins the terrible fraternity of those who have lost loved ones to incomprehensible evil. This is the story of Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre, the monster of Tenerife. Not because monsters deserve stories, but because the victims deserve remembering, the failures demand acknowledgement, and the living need reminding that vigilance and compassion for the vulnerable aren't luxuries, but necessities in a world where predators still hunt among us, waiting for the moment when we look away. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.